There exists a peculiar detail in the war record of the Second World War that tends to slip past most histories, a detail that speaks to the hidden architecture of victory. During the entire Pacific campaign, from the misty jungles of New Guinea to the blood-soaked beaches of the Philippines, one commanding general planned and executed nearly 70 amphibious operations without losing a single transport ship to enemy fire. 70, not one. The statistics alone seem almost implausible, yet the records bear it out, written carefully in archived after-action reports that few have ever read. This was not luck, nor was it the product of flamboyant genius or reckless daring. It was something quieter, something methodical. It was the work of a man whose name rarely appears in the same breath as Patton or MacArthur or Nimitz, yet whose fingerprints are etched across the very foundation of Pacific victory. Picture, if you will, a humid night sometime in the early 1940s, deep in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The air hangs thick and unmoving, carrying the smell of salt and vegetation and the faint percussion of distant surf rolling against some unseen shore. In a command tent, canvas walls that glow faintly from within, illuminated by a single lantern burning with a soft, amber light, a man sits hunched over a map table. The map is worn from handling, its edges curled, its surface marked with notations in pencil, lines drawn and redrawn as plans shift and evolve. The sound of the lantern is barely present, just the whisper-soft crackle of its wick consuming oil. Outside, the jungle breathes with the sounds of insects and the occasional call of a nocturnal bird. The man at the map table is General Walter Krueger, and in those still hours before dawn, while the camps around him sleep, he is constructing something vast, from mathematics and movement and supply lines that stretch across hundreds of miles of ocean. Who was Walter Krueger, and why has his story remained so long in shadow? If you've ever wondered about the quiet architects of history, the men whose names escape the popular memory even as their decisions shaped the course of nations, then this exploration will offer something deeper. If you listen to these sleep documentaries for the chance to encounter stories of the Second World War that go beyond the familiar narratives, stories of overlooked commanders and unseen victories, I'd invite you to subscribe now so you don't miss the full arc of this gentle, meticulous, utterly transformative life. This is the story of a man born in a corner of the German Empire who would come to command American armies in the Pacific. It is a story about methodology in an age of flash and bombast, about caution in an age of bold strokes. It is a story about the spaces between the famous battles, the unglamorous work of logistics and timing that allowed battles to be won in the first place, and it begins, fittingly, not on a battlefield at all, but in the quiet uncertainty of emigration and displacement, in a child's experience of crossing an ocean to an uncertain future. The lantern in that command tent burns on through the night, and the general studies his maps, planning the movements that will reshape the war. He does not know that historians will largely overlook his name. He does not know that his fellow general, George Patton, tempestuous, quotable, theatrical George Patton, will capture the public imagination in ways that his own careful, disciplined approach never could. He does not know that this nickname, the Patton of the Pacific, will follow him into history almost as a kind of gentle irony, a comparison that misses the mark as often as it finds it. He knows only that his men depend on the maps he studies, on the supply lines he envisions, on the timing of each operation down to the hour and the tide and the position of the sun. He knows that carefulness is not glamorous, but it saves lives. That precision is quieter than audacity, but it wins wars. So who was this man, really? Where did he come from? And how did a boy whose first language was not English, whose origins lay in a part of Europe that would soon become contested territory, come to hold the responsibility of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers? How did a private soldier, with neither West Point nor family connections or aristocratic bearing, climb the ranks to become one of the war's most consequential field commanders? These are the questions that pull us deeper into the night, deeper into the humid Pacific darkness where the maps wait to be read and the tide waits for no general, whether celebrated or forgotten. The surf continues its ancient rhythm beyond the tent walls. The insects maintain their chorus. The lantern flame flickers slightly, steadily, casting and recasting the shadows of Walter Krueger's hands across the maps that hold the next chapter of the war. In that moment, in that gathering of intelligence and experience and calculated decision-making, history is being written not with trumpets, but with patience, not with grand gestures, but with the careful arrangement of ships and supplies and men across vast distances. This is where our story truly begins, not at his birth, nor at his first command, but in the accumulation of decades of learning, thinking, and methodical preparation that would make him what he was when he needed to be at most. In the shadow of that tent, where the maps lay waiting and the humid night pressed close, there lived a man whose name would rarely reach the American public ear, yet whose methodical hands shaped the course of the entire Pacific War. General Walter Krueger was a study in quiet competence, a commander so deliberate in his thinking, so meticulous in his preparations, that history would eventually grant him a nickname that seemed, on its surface, almost contradictory, the Patton of the Pacific. Yet there was profound irony locked within those 4 words, for Krueger embodied everything that Patton was not. Where Patton blazed with theatrical confidence and public swagger, where he courted the camera and spoke in thunder, Krueger moved through the war with the careful, methodical precision of a master craftsman who needed no audience to validate his work. He was a man who let results speak, who trusted in preparation over personality, who understood that victories won in the jungle were often invisible to those reading the morning papers back home. The comparison that earned him that nickname did not arise from similar temperament or style. Rather, it came from the sheer scope of his accomplishments, the relentless forward momentum of the campaigns he orchestrated, and the undeniable mark he left upon the Pacific theater. Yet unlike Patton, whose every maneuver seemed designed for posterity, Krueger's genius lay in the unsexy art of logistics, in the unglamorous coordination of amphibious operations across vast stretches of ocean and hostile terrain. He was the architect of campaigns that moved armies with precision, that landed thousands of men on distant shores with minimal wasted motion, that advanced through some of the most difficult terrain in modern warfare, not through reckless audacity, but through meticulous planning and disciplined execution. And perhaps because of this very quality, because his victories lacked the theatrical flourish that made for compelling newspaper headlines, Krueger has remained largely forgotten by the broader currents of popular history, overshadowed by more flamboyant figures, less remembered than commanders whose names became household words. But this documentary exists to pull that curtain back, to examine the quiet general and his extraordinary contributions to the Allied victory in the Pacific. If you wish to join us as we explore the overlooked architects of World War II, the commanders whose names may not light up history's marquee, but whose minds and decisions saved countless lives and shaped the course of entire campaigns, we invite you to subscribe. Here, we dive deep into the commander's history left in shadow, and we take our time doing it, moving at a pace that allows the complexity of these figures to unfold without rushing. What made Krueger so different from the other generals who commanded in those distant theaters? Part of the answer lies in his origins, in the unlikely path that brought a boy born in the heart of Europe to become one of America's most trusted military commanders. For Krueger carried within him 2 worlds, the old world of Prussia and military tradition, and the new world of American democracy and boundless possibility. He was a man caught between continents, shaped by both, yet fully claimed by neither, until, through decades of patient service, he became wholly American in his bearing and his loyalties. His story begins not on a battlefield or in a gleaming academy, but in the quiet towns of Prussia, in the early years after the Civil War had ended, when the German Empire was still being born and America was still finding its footing as a nation. It is there, in that distant place and distant time, that we must begin to understand the man who would one day command hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Pacific Islands, moving them with a precision that suggested the hand of a master conductor rather than a military officer. His early years would set the pattern for everything that came after, a pattern of quiet determination, of learning through observation and study rather than reckless action, of moving steadily upward, not through connections or charm, but through demonstrated competence and an almost ascetic dedication to his craft. There was something almost monk-like about Krueger, something that suggested a man who had taken a vow of professional service, who saw in military science a kind of sacred calling that demanded complete devotion. He was not a man of sudden inspiration or flash genius. Rather, he was the type of officer who prepared for every contingency, who read deeply into military history and theory, who believed that the foundation of successful command lay not in individual brilliance, but in the accumulation of knowledge and the disciplined application of well-tested principles. In many ways, he represented an older, more European tradition of military thinking, the idea that warfare was a science to be mastered through study, that victory came not from the inspiration of the moment, but from months and years of careful planning and coordination. Yet he would carry these principles into the most modern form of warfare that the Pacific theater would see: amphibious assaults on an unprecedented scale, coordinated across vast distances, involving not just armies but navies and air forces, all moving in concert. The question that haunts us as we contemplate his life is this: why does history remember so clearly the generals who sought the spotlight, while allowing the quiet architects of victory to fade into obscurity? Perhaps it is simply that drama makes for better stories, that human memory gravitates toward personality and conflict, and the memorable quote, leaving little room for the patient, methodical work of coordination and planning. Or perhaps it is that Krueger's very effectiveness made his job look easier than it was, made the impossible seem merely difficult, and in doing so, allowed the magnitude of his achievement to be taken for granted. What we do know is that as we trace the arc of his life, from a young boy in Prussia to an old man in quiet retirement, we are tracing the arc not just of one remarkable officer, but of an entire tradition of American military excellence, the tradition of the professional soldier who serves without need for recognition, who does the hard work in the shadows so that others may enjoy the spotlight. The story of Walter Krueger begins not in America, but in the green countryside of East Prussia, in a small town called Flatau, where in the winter of 1881 he entered the world as the son of a Prussian man whose name and face would soon fade into the distant past. His father, Julius Krueger, was a man of modest means, a soldier himself, though the details of his life remain shadowed in the historical record, as if the very act of emigration erased what came before. We know that young Walter grew up speaking German, in a household where the rhythms and structures of Prussian life formed the quiet architecture of his childhood, where discipline and duty were not abstract concepts, but the air one breathed. The family lived modestly, without great wealth or connections, and perhaps it was precisely this ordinariness that would later make Walter Krueger's journey so remarkable. How does a boy raised in the rigid order of Imperial Prussia become the steady hand guiding American armies across the Pacific? The answer lies, in part, in the courage of his parents. When Walter was still very young, some accounts suggest he was barely 8 or 9 years old, his family made the decision that would alter the course of his life. They emigrated to America. We might pause here to imagine what this journey must have meant. The decision to leave behind everything familiar, the language, the landscape, the smell of Prussian pine forests, and the particular way light falls on the Baltic plains, all abandoned for the promise of a new world across the ocean. Walter's mother, whose name was Lena, and his father Julius made the passage with their son, arriving in the United States in the late 1880s, when the country itself was still consolidating its identity as an industrial power, still finding its footing as a continental nation. They settled in Louisiana, in the warm, humid climate so different from the cool seasons of East Prussia, a displacement not merely of geography, but of every sensory anchor a young boy possessed. Louisiana, in those years, was a place of transformation. The post-Reconstruction South was slowly rebuilding itself, and German immigrants, skilled workers and farmers alike found niches in its developing economy. The Krueger family was not wealthy, and young Walter grew up in modest circumstances, attending school and learning English with the peculiar intensity that children possess when mastering a new language. It must have been a disorienting experience to leave behind the German tongue, the German schools, the German way of ordering the world, and to adopt, gradually and then completely, the customs and speech of his adopted nation. Yet there is something in this early displacement that seems to have shaped Krueger's temperament. Perhaps it taught him adaptability. Perhaps it instilled in him an understanding that loyalty could transcend the place of one's birth, that allegiance could be chosen rather than inherited. As Walter Krueger grew into a young man, the Spanish-American War was gathering on the horizon like storm clouds. The year was 1898, and America was beginning to feel the stirring of its own power, the sense that its moment on the world stage was arriving. The world does not often record what inner compulsion drives a young man toward military service, but we know that Krueger, now in his mid-20s, having grown up in America, though born of Prussian parents, felt called to serve. He enlisted as a private soldier, the humblest rank, the ground floor of military hierarchy. There is something almost poignant about this choice. A young man of German birth, who might have felt himself caught between two worlds, instead chose to bind himself to one of them through the most binding commitment available, military service. He joined the United States Army, becoming not merely an immigrant, but a soldier of his adopted nation. Consider for a moment the significance of this choice. Krueger was turning away from the Prussian military tradition of his birth, the very tradition that had shaped his father and grandfather, and instead offering his service to the United States. It was an act of definitive allegiance, made at an age when such decisions still carried the weight of permanence. The Spanish-American War was brief, almost comically swift by later standards, a mere 10 weeks of conflict with Spain, but it marked the beginning of Krueger's military career, and it placed him on a trajectory that would span the better part of the 20th century. He served in the Philippines during those post-war years when American forces were fighting insurgencies and consolidating control over newly acquired territories, and in those dusty years abroad, the young private from Louisiana, born in Prussia, was being forged into something new, an American soldier. What is remarkable is how completely Krueger's Prussian heritage seems to have receded from public view as he rose through the ranks. Unlike some officers who carried their ethnic identities as badges of distinction, Krueger simply became American. Perhaps it was the necessity of the times. This was an era when ethnic identity in the military was often viewed with suspicion, when loyalty was questioned and reassured almost obsessively. Or perhaps it was Krueger's own temperament, his natural reticence, his preference for letting his work speak for itself rather than his personal narrative. The boy who had arrived in Louisiana speaking German, surrounded by the sensory world of East Prussia, had become so thoroughly American that by the time his great victories would come, few remembered or cared about his origins. And yet those origins had left their mark, indelible and quiet, in the orderliness of his mind, the discipline of his approach, the careful way he would later build and coordinate vast military machines. The irony is gentle and profound. Krueger carried within him the military traditions of Prussia, the lessons of European discipline and organization, but he deployed them in service to America. The very nation that had once been colonized by German militarism now benefited from the Prussian virtues of order, precision, and systematic thought, channeled through a man who had walked away from his birth nation as a youth and never looked back. In a very real sense, Krueger represented a kind of alchemy, the transformation of immigrant experience into American military excellence, the way that displacement and choice could forge something new and unexpected. As he moved through the decades of military service ahead of him, rising slowly through the ranks, mastering languages and military theory, this fundamental act of choosing would remain at the core of who he was, a man of Prussian origin who had become, utterly and completely, an American soldier. In the spring of 1898, when America turned its attention toward the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and Pacific, a young German-American man named Walter Krueger made a choice that would alter the course of his life. He was in his mid-20s by then, living in what felt like the margin of American society, not quite native, not quite foreign, seeking a place where his talents might be recognized and his ambitions shaped into something meaningful. The Spanish-American War, brief and turbulent as it would prove to be, offered him that doorway. He enlisted as a private soldier, not as an officer, though he might have sought a commission, not with connections or family wealth to secure him a comfortable position, but as an ordinary enlisted man, a private in the ranks, shouldering a rifle and accepting the discipline and hardship that came with it. This decision reveals something essential about Krueger's character, a willingness to begin at the absolute bottom, to learn the army from the ground upward, to understand the life of the common soldier before he would ever presume to command one. The United States Army of that era was not what it would become. It was still finding its footing as a global military power, still experimenting with tactics and organization, still filled with officers whose experience came largely from the Indian Wars and the aftermath of the Civil War. The regular army was small, underfunded, and often overlooked. When war came with Spain, many of the campaigns were confusion and improvisation, disease claiming more lives than enemy bullets. To enlist, then, was not to join a glorious institution, but a struggling, uncertain force, learning its own capabilities. Krueger served in the Philippines during the American occupation that followed Spain's defeat. The islands, newly American, became a proving ground for a different kind of warfare, not the set-piece battles of conventional conflict, but counterinsurgency, jungle operations, and the slow, grinding business of holding territory against an enemy that refused to accept American sovereignty. It was hot, difficult work. Disease was endemic, supply lines were tenuous, the enemy was often invisible, striking from darkness and then vanishing into forest. For a young private in those campaigns, survival itself was an achievement. Yet within this harsh schooling, Krueger was absorbing something invaluable. He was learning how armies actually functioned at the most basic level, how food moved to the front lines, how orders traveled through a chain of command, how discipline held units together under stress. He was observing officers and measuring them against what he learned. He was beginning to ask himself the quiet questions that would define his entire career. What makes an army effective? How does one move men and supplies across difficult terrain? What is the difference between a plan that looks good on paper and one that actually works in the field? The Spanish-American War itself lasted only 10 weeks of actual combat, though American involvement in the Philippines extended much longer. During those formative months and years, Krueger kept his eyes open and his mind attentive. A private soldier in a foreign war, living in tropical heat, working within the rigid hierarchy of military rank, he remained unmarked and unnoticed, exactly as a private should be. But he was watching, he was learning, he was already building in his mind a framework for understanding military operations that would mature over decades into something far more sophisticated. Why did Krueger choose to remain in the army after those first campaigns? Many enlisted men left after their service ended, returning home to civilian life, to farms or shops or factories. The military had no special glory attached to it in peacetime. The pay was modest. The work could be mundane, but Krueger saw something in the army that called to him, perhaps the structure, perhaps the sense of purpose, perhaps simply the knowledge that there was much more to learn. He decided, quietly and without fanfare, that this would be his life. The climb from private to officer took years, longer than it might have for a man with a prestigious education or powerful patrons. Krueger had neither. What he had was competence, reliability, and an almost monastic dedication to self-improvement. He studied in whatever moments he could find. He learned languages not because he had to, but because understanding foreign military texts might give him insights unavailable to his peers. He observed everything. He took notes. he built a foundation of knowledge that would eventually compensate for his lack of formal military academy training. His early promotions came slowly. From private, he rose through the enlisted ranks: corporal, sergeant, first sergeant. These were not glamorous positions, but they were essential ones. A first sergeant in that era was often the true heart of a military unit, the person who actually ran the day-to-day operations, while officers dealt with strategy and protocol. To serve in such a role was to understand the psychology of soldiers, the logistics of movement, the human cost of bad decisions made at higher levels. Eventually, and only after years of demonstrated competence, Krueger received a commission as an officer. By the standards of many military men, his path was unconventional, up through the enlisted ranks rather than down from the academy. Some officers viewed this with subtle disdain, others recognized it as evidence of genuine capability. Krueger himself seemed indifferent to either judgment. He had done the work. He had earned his place. The means by which he arrived there were less important to him than the responsibility that now lay before him. What strikes one, looking back at this period of his life, is the absence of any sense of urgency or ambition in the conventional sense. Krueger did not seek promotion. He did not court favorable notice. He performed his duties with meticulous care and moved forward when opportunity presented itself, but without the hunger for advancement that animated many military men. This restraint, this quiet refusal to pursue glory or rapid ascent, would become his signature. Even as his rank grew and his responsibility expanded, he remained fundamentally the same man, focused on competence, on learning, on the unglamorous work of making military organizations actually function. The Spanish-American War and its aftermath were, in a sense, Krueger's apprenticeship. It was a time when he learned not just military procedure, but something deeper: the weight of command, the importance of logistics, the reality that wars are won not by dramatic gestures, but by meticulous preparation and sustained effort. These lessons, absorbed during those early years as a private and young officer, would underpin everything he accomplished later. They were lessons that could only be learned from the ground up, by understanding the soldier's perspective before adopting the general's view. And in that humble beginning, in that willingness to start at the very bottom and climb with methodical patience, lay the seeds of a military career unlike any other in the American Pacific War. But there was one barrier that would shadow him throughout his career, at least in the minds of those who kept such ledgers. He had never attended West Point. The military academy was the sanctioned pathway, the gilded gate through which most American officers passed, and Krueger's absence from its halls meant he would always carry a whisper of outsider status, no matter how far his talents carried him. Yet this very absence became the crucible in which his discipline was forged, for he possessed something that academies cannot always teach: an almost monastic hunger to master the art of warfare through rigorous, solitary study. In the quiet hours of his barracks and quarters, in the margins of his days between duties, Krueger began to collect military texts, as another man might collect religious manuscripts. He taught himself German, not merely to speak it, but to read the dense, technical prose of German military theorists and historians, with the precision of a scholar parsing ancient texts. The language of his childhood, which he had carried from Prussia like a half-remembered song, became a key that unlocked entire libraries of strategic thought. German military tradition, born from centuries of small wars and grand campaigns across fractured principalities, held within it a philosophy of combined arms, of coordination between infantry and cavalry, of the marriage between logistics and maneuver. Krueger read deeply into this tradition, absorbing not merely the tactics but the mindset, the very discipline of German military thinking. French, too, became his second scholarly language. After the Great War, as the world shifted and American officers began to absorb the hard lessons of industrial combat, Krueger mastered French well enough to read the works of French military theorists and to study the meticulous after-action reports that emerged from the Western Front. France had endured the most devastating land war Europe had yet known, and its officers, many of them still alive, still writing, still teaching, carried within their writings the weight of millions of lives lost to miscalculation and obsolete thinking. Their insights, written in the formal French of military academies, became part of Krueger's private education. And then Spanish, for Krueger understood that warfare was not merely a European conversation. The armies of Spain, the colonial campaigns in the Philippines themselves, the emerging military thought of Latin America, all of this held lessons for an officer in an increasingly global American military. To read Spanish military theory and history was to expand the aperture of his understanding, to refuse the parochialism that might have confined his thinking to a single tradition. This self-education was not some romantic notion of a scholar-soldier reading by candlelight. It was methodical, almost obsessive. Krueger would acquire texts, work through them systematically, extract ideas, compare them to what he was learning through practical experience, and synthesize them into a coherent philosophy of his own. He did not simply absorb these texts as revelation. He read them critically, questioning their assumptions, testing their logic against the problems he encountered in his actual duties. In effect, Krueger was constructing his own graduate education in military science and strategy, brick by brick, language by language, text by text. This self-directed scholarship served a deeper psychological purpose as well. It was a way of proving, to himself, if not to others, that the absence of a West Point diploma need not be a permanent limitation. Every language mastered was a small victory against that old excluded feeling. Every technical treatise understood was evidence of capability and seriousness. There was in Krueger's autodidactism a quiet determination, almost a defiance, that said, "I will learn what I need to learn. I will become what the system suggests I cannot become." The irony, of course, was that officers who had merely attended West Point, who had sat passively through lectures and absorbed the current orthodoxies of their era, would never develop the intellectual rigor that Krueger forged through his own relentless study. What made this self-education particularly powerful was its integration with his practical experience. Krueger was not retreating into theory, he was constantly moving between field experience and scholarly reflection. When he served on various staffs, when he studied military campaigns both historical and contemporary, when he observed the evolution of warfare and weaponry, he was filtering all of it through the lenses of German precision, French analytical rigor, and Spanish imperial organization. He was, in essence, creating a composite military mind that drew on multiple traditions while remaining distinctly his own. By the 1920s and 1930s, as he moved through the interwar years holding various positions and continuing to climb the slow ladder of military rank, Krueger had become something unusual in the American officer corps, a genuinely learned military intellectual, not through formal credentialing, but through austere, unceasing self-discipline. The languages he had mastered were not mere accomplishments to list. They were evidence of a mind that refused to be confined, that reached across boundaries to gather knowledge, that understood that a truly educated officer must look beyond his own nation's military tradition. The question that might have haunted a less secure man, "Why did I not go to West Point?" had been transformed by Krueger's response into something more interesting. What can I become by teaching myself? And in that transformation lay both a clue to his character and a hint of the methodical, thoughtful command style that would later emerge in the Pacific. For a man who had educated himself, who had proven through sheer will and intellect that formal credentials need not define capability, was a man who might carry into battle a kind of humble confidence. He knew what he knew through hard work, and he was secure enough in that knowledge to make decisions based on reason rather than ego, on careful analysis rather than flash and impulse. The years between the wars were a peculiar time in military life, a long pause between great convulsions, and Walter Krueger inhabited them with the same quiet purpose that had marked his entire career. He was a staff officer now, a position that suited his temperament far more than any parade ground ever could. While other ambitious officers chafed at the confines of peacetime service, Krueger seemed to find in it something almost meditative, the chance to study, to think, to refine the machinery of armies, without the urgency of actual combat breathing down his neck. He moved through a series of assignments that, to the casual observer, might have seemed routine, even unremarkable. Fort Leavenworth, where he had studied so voraciously as a younger man, saw him return more than once, in positions where his expertise was quietly sought out and relied upon. Other posts followed, each one adding another layer to his vast mental archive of military knowledge. At each step, those who worked closely with him began to recognize something that would eventually become his hallmark, an almost preternatural ability to see the whole picture, to grasp not just what needed to be done, but precisely how to do it, with minimal waste and maximum efficiency. His reputation as a brilliant staff officer grew steadily, almost invisibly, like a tree growing rings in the forest where few passed to notice. What was perhaps most remarkable about Krueger during these interwar decades was his absolute refusal to seek the spotlight. This was no false modesty, but rather a genuine indifference to acclaim. While other officers courted newspaper correspondence and angled for prominent assignments that might land them in photographs, Krueger simply worked. He submitted papers on military theory, circulated his thoughts on the organization of armies, engaged in the earnest professional conversations that animated the officer corps during those years. He was respected, consulted, valued, and largely unknown to the public, even to most of the American military establishment, beyond a fairly narrow circle of serious professionals. There was something almost austere about this approach to advancement. Most men who rise through the ranks carry with them some element of self-promotion, some instinctive drive to make their talents visible and attractive to those who distribute promotions. Krueger seemed to move according to a different calculus entirely. His advancement came because his competence was undeniable, because the officers above him recognized something genuine in his work, and because in a military organization, such things eventually matter. The promotions came steadily, if not swiftly, each one the natural consequence of demonstrated ability rather than any campaign of self-aggrandizement. These were the years, too, when Krueger's private life took on a shape that would remain constant for the rest of his days. If his professional life was marked by careful study and measured advancement, his domestic world was one of genuine quietude. He had married Grace Hester, a woman of considerable steadiness and good sense, and together they had built a marriage notable for its straightforward decency. They would eventually have 2 children, and in the various posts where Krueger was assigned, Grace managed the small dislocations of military life with the practiced grace of a good officer's wife. There were no scandals attached to the Krueger household, no wild stories or memorable incidents. Precisely the kind of thing that marks a genuinely stable domestic arrangement. One can imagine him in the evenings, after the duties of the day were done, settling into his study with a book on military history or theory, perhaps discussing the day's work with Grace, who seems to have understood, without ever needing it fully explained, the peculiar demands and satisfactions of her husband's professional calling. Their home, wherever the army happened to station them, was the kind of place where order prevailed, where standards were maintained without stiffness, where a man could rest and gather himself for the next phase of his work. It is worth reflecting for a moment on how rare this kind of steadiness had become by the 20th century. The military life of that era, particularly for ambitious officers, carried with it considerable social ferment. There were parties, gatherings, the constant negotiation of rank and precedence that characterized officer society. Some men thrived in this atmosphere, understood its unwritten rules, moved through it with the grace of natural politicians. Krueger, by all accounts, was simply not one of these men. He attended what was required, conducted himself with proper courtesy, but seemed always somewhat apart from the broader social currents of military life. And yet, this very quality, this refusal to play the games that so many of his contemporaries took for granted, may have actually served him well. There is something about steadiness, about a man who stays true to his actual purposes and concerns, that eventually commands respect. Colleagues who might initially have dismissed him as dull or overly serious gradually came to understand that he was not dull at all, but rather intensely focused on matters of genuine importance. The steady accumulation of experience during these decades was also, in many ways, the real preparation for what would come later. The actual conduct of war, when it finally arrived, would place extraordinary demands on a military leader. There would be no time to learn on the job, no opportunity to gradually work one's way toward competence. Everything that happened in those years of peace, every assignment, every study, every careful observation of how armies actually functioned, would become, in retrospect, a kind of extended preparation for one man's crucial role in a vast Pacific conflict. Krueger seemed to understand this instinctively. He was not simply passing time during the interwar period, waiting for war to break out so that his real career could begin. Rather, he was building something with absolute seriousness and precision, brick by brick, week by week, year by year. Each promotion brought slightly broader responsibilities. Each assignment placed him in a position to observe and learn something new about the organization of military forces, and through it all, he maintained the personal stability that would allow him to function under the most intense pressure years hence. One might wonder, in the quietness of these middle years, whether Krueger ever imagined what lay ahead. Certainly, the gathering storm in Europe and the growing tensions in the Pacific must have been apparent to any thinking officer. But the specific contours of his future role, the vast armies he would command, the crucial operations he would oversee, the relationship with one of the war's most powerful personalities, none of this could have been predicted or fully anticipated. He simply continued his work, continued his studies, continued his quiet advancement through the ranks. He was a man building a foundation, without necessarily knowing exactly what structure would eventually be erected upon it. And yet, when the moment came, when the weight of history descended upon the military establishment, and urgent demands were placed on every officer of proven competence, Walter Krueger would be ready. That readiness was not the product of luck or accident, but rather of decades of deliberate, methodical preparation, conducted in the firm belief that a soldier's duty was to be prepared for whatever his country might ask of him. When the great powers of Europe descended into the trenches in the autumn of 1914, Walter Krueger was already 34 years old, a captain in the United States Army, and quietly observing from afar the grinding machinery of industrial warfare. He watched as millions of men were fed into the artillery barrages and machine gun barrages of the Western Front, and he began to understand, in those early years of the war, that something fundamental had changed about how armies would fight. The old doctrines of cavalry charges and quick, decisive movements seemed to dissolve into mud and barbed wire and endless, aching stalemate. And Krueger, the methodical student of military science, began taking careful notes. It would be 2.5 years before the United States entered the war, 2.5 years during which Krueger's mind was turning over the problems he saw unfolding in France. How did you move hundreds of thousands of men across an ocean and land them on hostile shores? How did you keep them fed and supplied when the supply lines stretched across thousands of miles? How did you coordinate the movements of infantry and artillery and engineers so that each supported the others in the terrible dance of modern combat? These were not questions that had answers written in the textbooks he had studied as a younger man. The war in Europe was writing new textbooks in blood and steel, and officers like Krueger were reading every page they could reach. When America finally declared war in April of 1917, Krueger was among the first officers selected for the American Expeditionary Forces bound for France. He was assigned not to a fighting division, but to the headquarters staff, a position that might have seemed less glamorous than a field command, but which would prove to be the crucible that shaped his genius. The Great War, it turned out, would be won or lost not by individual acts of valor, though those were plentiful, but by the invisible men who planned supply movements, calculated troop deployments, coordinated with Allied commanders, and ensured that the vast machine of an army actually functioned. Krueger was sent to serve with the American First Army under General John J. Pershing, and there, in the shadow of the greatest general of his time, He absorbed lessons that would guide him for the rest of his life. The war in France in those final 18 months was chaos and agony, compressed into a finite space, and yet it was also, for a mind like Krueger's, an extraordinary education. He was witness to the Battle of Belleau Wood, where the Marines advanced against machine guns across open ground, and the losses were measured in tens of thousands. He observed the preparations for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which would become the largest American military operation of the war, and he helped craft the logistical support that had to feed and equip 500,000 American soldiers in the autumn of 1918. Do you understand how staggering that was? 500,000 men, suddenly concentrated in a foreign land, requiring food, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement boots, spare parts for trucks and guns, hay for horses, gasoline for whatever mechanized vehicles existed then. Every shell that exploded on the other side of the wire had first to be manufactured in America, shipped across the Atlantic at risk of submarine attack, unloaded at a French port, transported hundreds of miles inland, and stored in depots before it could be distributed to the artillery batteries. That was logistics. That was coordination. And that was what Krueger learned to do. He served as chief of staff of various divisions and corps as the war progressed, and in each position, he proved himself to be an officer of uncommon capability, not flashy, not prone to dramatic pronouncements, but reliable and thoughtful, and possessed of a remarkable memory for detail. He understood that wars were not won by individual moments of genius, but by the accumulated small decisions, the careful planning, the meticulous attention to supply and communication, and the welfare of the men under command. He was a student of how things actually worked, not how they appeared in official reports. He learned which officers could be trusted with responsibility, which ones needed closer supervision, where bottlenecks formed in the supply system, and how to unclog them. He learned, perhaps most importantly, that the men who make history are often the ones whose names do not appear in the headlines. By the time the armistice came in November of 1918, Krueger had internalized the lessons of modern warfare at its most complex and unforgiving. The static trenches and the grinding attrition of the Western Front had given way, in those final months, to something closer to what he would recognize as mobile warfare. The German spring offensive of 1918, followed by the Allied counteroffensive, suggested that armies could still maneuver, still achieve surprise, still strike at weak points if the logistics were managed correctly, and if there was sufficient coordination between the different arms. It was a glimpse of the future, though few officers recognized it at the time. The Great War, in its dying days, had shown that victory could belong to the side that could move faster and strike harder than the enemy could recover, but only if the invisible machinery of supply and coordination was working perfectly. And that was a lesson Krueger understood in his bones. He returned to America in the aftermath of the war, with a reputation as one of the most capable staff officers in the American Expeditionary Forces. The officers who had worked with him remembered him not for any brilliant tactical stroke or memorable act of leadership in the field, but for his quiet competence, his ability to take a confused situation and make sense of it, to take the orders of a superior and translate them into action that actually achieved the intended result. In the years after 1918, as the army contracted and budgets shrank and promotion became glacially slow, Krueger carried those lessons with him, like water in a cupped hand. The war in France had taught him that the real architecture of victory was built in the planning, in the coordination, in the patient accumulation of resources, and the careful orchestration of their use. It was a lesson he would spend the rest of his military career refining and perfecting, a lesson that would, in time, help him win the war against Japan from half a world away. The decades between the wars were formative years for a man who seemed, to his contemporaries, almost to be living in a different time than they were. While many officers in the peacetime army settled into routine, Krueger found himself increasingly drawn to questions that few around him seemed to be asking with any urgency. How should an army of the future move? What role would machines, tanks, trucks, aircraft play in the next great conflict? And crucially, How could different branches of the military, so often divided by tradition and jealously guarded prerogatives, learn to work together as a seamless instrument of war? The 1920s had been a period of retrenchment and skepticism in American military circles. Budgets were tight, morale was uncertain, and there remained a lingering sense that the mechanized horrors of the First World War had been an aberration, not a preview of things to come. Yet Krueger, perhaps because his immigrant mind had always bent toward careful observation of the world as it actually was, rather than as men wished it to be, began to study the theoretical writings emerging from Europe with particular intensity. He read the German theorists, naturally, given his fluency in the language. He absorbed their ideas about Panzergruppen, about the coordinated movement of armor, artillery, and air power. He studied the Soviet experiments with deep mechanized thrusts, and he contemplated how such doctrines might apply to American circumstances, American resources, and American advantages. What set Krueger apart in these years was not radical thinking. He was never a visionary in the manner of the most avant-garde strategists, but rather a methodical, almost scholarly approach to integrating new ideas into existing military frameworks. He was a synthesizer. He took the innovations that others had theorized and asked himself, what would this actually mean in practice? How would supply lines function? How would commanders communicate across vast distances? What were the logistical requirements? These were not questions that stirred the blood of glory-seeking officers, yet they were the questions upon which every campaign ultimately depended. During his assignments in the 1920s and 1930s, Krueger began to quietly advocate for what would later be called joint operations. The coordinated action of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, working not as separate entities, but as components of a unified whole. This may seem self-evident to modern ears, accustomed as we are to the language of inter-service coordination, but at the time, the Army, the Navy, and the nascent Air Force were often barely on speaking terms. Service rivalries ran deep, budgets were allocated along rigid institutional lines, and the idea that they should subordinate their independence to some larger operational plan seemed to many like a threat to their very identity. Krueger's approach was characteristically patient. He did not rail against the system. He did not publish manifestos or seek attention through dramatic pronouncements. Instead, in lectures at staff colleges, in position papers quietly circulated among his peers, in conversations with fellow officers who respected his knowledge and his judgment, he laid out the case with calm, mathematical precision. He showed how mechanized columns could move faster than traditional formations if they were supported by air cover and sustained by efficient supply operations. He demonstrated through careful analysis how the coordination of armor, infantry, and artillery could break through enemy lines more decisively than any of these elements could achieve in isolation. He reasoned through the logistical mathematics of amphibious operations, a topic that would later become acutely relevant, showing how men and supplies could be moved across water and landed on hostile shores if everything was orchestrated with sufficient care and preparation. These interwar years were also when Krueger deepened his study of what might be called the hidden side of warfare, the supply chain itself, the movement of ammunition and food and fuel that determined not who had the most courage or the most weapons, but who could keep an army functioning when stress and distance threatened to snap the bonds of cooperation. Many officers, even many successful ones, regarded logistics as a subordinate concern, something to be attended to by quartermasters and supply officers, while the real business of strategy was conducted at headquarters by the war-minded. Krueger was different. He understood, perhaps from his immigrant background, from his years watching careful families make do with limited resources, from his own disciplined temperament, that logistics was not a servant to strategy, but its foundation. An army, no matter how brilliant its commander, could accomplish nothing if it ran out of ammunition, or food, or fuel. When Krueger took positions on the War Department General Staff during this period, his influence began to subtly reshape institutional thinking. He was not commanding armies, not yet, but his voice, respected for its precision and its evident knowledge, carried weight in discussions about doctrine, about training methods, about the structure of the army itself. Younger officers began to absorb his ideas about mechanized warfare and coordination. Plans were drafted, war games were imagined, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the American military began to shift its doctrinal thinking in directions that would prove crucial when war came. It would be perhaps too much to say that Krueger single-handedly shaped this transformation. The momentum came from many sources, from the growing influence of mechanized warfare advocates throughout the military, from the clear evidence of tank-led breakthroughs in European military thought, from the gradual modernization of American industry itself. Yet Krueger's particular contribution was distinctive. He offered not the romance of new machines or the excitement of revolutionary strategy, but rather a careful, workable synthesis of mechanization and the timeless requirements of military success. He showed how armor could be integrated into American military culture without displacing the proven value of infantry. He demonstrated how air power could enhance rather than replace ground operations. He made the new ideas fit with American resources, American training methods, and American organizational culture. By the time the 1930s were giving way to the 1940s and the gathering storm over Europe, Krueger's reputation among the professional officer corps was quietly secure. He was not famous, not in the way that some more flamboyant commanders were beginning to become. He was not the sort of man whose name appeared in newspapers or whose opinions were sought by politicians, but among those who understood the mechanics of military organization, he was recognized as a man who knew his business with unusual depth and clarity. And when the army began to expand, when training camps were suddenly filled with new recruits, when the machinery of industrial war began to accelerate, it was men like Krueger, with their disciplined thinking and their long study of how modern armies must function, who would prove indispensable. By the late 1930s, as Europe darkened and the prospect of American involvement grew less hypothetical by the season, the United States Army began the laborious work of preparing for a war it hoped would never come. And somewhere in that vast machinery of preparation, a quiet German-American officer named Walter Krueger was about to step into a kind of spotlight, not the theatrical, camera-filled spotlight that others would seek, but rather the steady, admiring gaze of military planners who recognized in him something rare, a mind that could hold thousands of details in perfect arrangement, like a master musician keeping every instrument in exquisite balance. The opportunity came through the war games. The Army, in those crucial years before Pearl Harbor, conducted increasingly elaborate field exercises across the American landscape. These maneuvers served multiple purposes. They tested doctrine, evaluated equipment, rotated thousands of soldiers through simulated combat conditions, and allowed senior commanders to assess the talents of their subordinates in realistic scenarios. Officers were being tried and sorted, judged in the crucible of these games, and those who excelled would be marked for higher responsibility. Krueger's assignment to command the Third Army in these stateside war games seemed, on its surface, a natural progression of his steadily climbing rank. He was a major general now, competent, respected, unremarkable in appearance or manner, yet something about the way he approached those exercises set him apart from commanders who treated the games as obligatory interruptions in their schedules. For Krueger, the war games were essentially practice for the real thing, and he intended to use them as a laboratory. The meticulous planning that would become his signature began to crystallize during these maneuvers. Krueger understood, with an almost instinctive clarity, that victory in modern warfare would flow not from heroic gestures or brilliant improvisation, but from the unglamorous fundamentals: supply lines secured and protected, logistics calculated down to ammunition counts, intelligence gathered and synthesized, timing coordinated across dozens of moving pieces. While other commanders might concentrate on the dramatic clash of main forces, the great encirclement, the cavalry charge reimagined in tanks, Krueger was mentally constructing the invisible architecture that would make such moments possible. Those who watched him during the exercises noticed something distinctive in his method. He would arrive at a command post with his staff, and instead of issuing grand directives, he would ask questions. Searching, specific questions about terrain, about supply depots, about the condition of roads, about the enemy's likely intentions given the map and the season and the disposition of forces. He seemed to be constructing a three-dimensional model of reality in his mind, and only once that model was complete would he move pieces into position. Other generals moved faster. Krueger moved with purposeful deliberation, and when his forces engaged, they were already positioned to succeed because the outcome had been anticipated and prepared for, not left to chance. What might seem like caution to a casual observer was actually something far more sophisticated. It was confidence born of thorough understanding. A man who knows every variable is comfortable taking decisive action. A man who improvises is by definition uncertain. The war games of that era became increasingly ambitious in scale. Units numbering in the tens of thousands would maneuver across entire regions, practicing the kind of large-scale coordination that modern warfare demanded. Krueger's Third Army gained a reputation for executing complex operations with minimal confusion, for moving supplies where they needed to be before the demand became critical, for achieving objectives while preserving the strength of its forces for the next objective. His after-action reports were models of clarity, written in prose that was almost ascetic in its directness, no ornamentation, no self-aggrandizement, simply an accurate accounting of what had been attempted, what had been learned, and what might be improved. Military observers began to note his name. War Department planners began to understand that here was an officer who might be trusted with responsibility on a scale that had not yet been demanded of him. He was not flashy, certainly not charismatic, but he was producing results that survived scrutiny. And perhaps more importantly, his methods could be studied, understood, and replicated by other officers under his command. He was not a genius who worked by intuition alone. He was a systematizer, someone who believed that military excellence could be achieved through rigorous thinking and careful preparation. Those who worked for him during this period began to develop a distinctive culture. Staff officers under Krueger learned to think in layers, to anticipate consequences several moves ahead, to respect the value of information and planning above all else. There was no tolerance for sloppiness, no excuse accepted for inadequate preparation, but neither was there fear of honest mistakes in analysis or unexpected setbacks. What mattered was that the thinking had been sound, the effort genuine, the learning rapid. The contrast with other commanders of his era became increasingly apparent as the war games continued through the 1930s and into the early 1940s. Some generals treated their assignments as ceremonial, checking boxes and waiting for retirement. Others viewed command as an opportunity for glory, for dramatic maneuvers that would be noticed and discussed and written about. Krueger seemed indifferent to glory, almost purposefully so. He had chosen a kind of anonymity, the anonymity of the thoroughly competent professional. And that choice, that refusal to seek the spotlight, would prove to be its own form of distinction. What Krueger did not know, as he conducted these meticulous exercises across American soil, was that his methods and his reputation were being noted by those who would shape the higher strategy of the war soon to come. The patience he demonstrated, the analytical depth, the respect for logistics and planning, these were exactly the qualities that would be needed in the vast, grinding campaigns of the Pacific Theater. The war games were preparation, yes, but they were also auditions, whether Krueger fully understood that or not. By the time America entered the war in December of 1941, Krueger's name was known to those who truly understood military matters. He was not famous in the way that newspaper readers might recognize a face or remember a dramatic headline. But among those responsible for winning the war, he had already proven something essential: that careful thinking, disciplined planning, and respect for the details of operations could produce consistent, measurable results. The question that was beginning to form in the minds of the highest military leadership was not whether Krueger could handle larger responsibility, but how soon that responsibility could be given to him, and what magnificent, terrible work he might accomplish with it. When the nickname first began to circulate in military circles during the war years, those who heard it often did a double take. The Patton of the Pacific, they called him, Walter Krueger. And if you knew anything about George Patton, the pearl-handled revolvers, the dramatic speeches before battle, the way he seemed to conduct warfare like a symphony, all swagger and visibility and the calculated theatricality of a man who understood that legend was as much a weapon as armor plating, then the comparison seemed almost laughable. Because Krueger was the opposite in nearly every measurable way. Where Patton wore his confidence like a uniform tailored specifically to turn heads, Krueger moved through the world with a kind of deliberate anonymity. His uniform was correct, unremarkable. His voice, when he spoke, did not boom across a room seeking admiration. He had a slightly German accent that never quite faded, even after decades in America, and he spoke with the measured precision of a man choosing each word as if laying bricks. His face was lean, weathered, lined with the kind of permanent thoughtfulness you see in men who spend their hours studying maps and supply manifests, rather than performing for crowds. Patton was a showman of the highest order. He loved the press, understood its power, cultivated his image with the care of an artist. He wanted men to see him, to feel his presence, to believe in his invincibility through the sheer force of his personality. Krueger, by contrast, seemed almost uncomfortable with attention. His satisfaction came from the efficiency of the operation, not from the accolades that followed it. A war correspondent once tried to interview him at his command post, hoping for some of that Patton fire, some memorable quote for the newspapers back home. Krueger gave him the facts, the situation summary, the tactical overview, and nothing more. No prophecies, no dramatic visions, just the work itself, laid out plainly. What makes the nickname particularly interesting is how it reveals something deeper about the nature of military reputation. Patton became a legend. He is remembered, quoted, made into films and legends and popular imagination because of the very theatricality that made him brilliant in certain contexts. His personality was impossible to ignore, but what, one might ask, defines a general's true legacy? Is it the memory of his presence and charisma, or is it the invisible architecture of victories won through meticulous planning and an almost monastic devotion to preparation? Krueger's temperament was, in many ways, shaped by his background and his nature. He was not born to American confidence and American swagger. He was born in East Prussia, in a culture that valued thoroughness over flash, that believed a man's work should speak louder than his words. As he rose through the ranks, he seemed to become even more insular, more focused on the technical challenges of military science, and less interested in the politics of visibility that had always animated Patton's career. Patton was, in some sense, a romantic. He believed in glory, in the triumph of will, in the drama of the moment. Krueger was a pragmatist, almost a rationalist. He believed in preparation, in supply lines, in understanding terrain and weather and disease, and all the unglamorous factors that determined whether an operation succeeded or failed. Yet both men won. Both were generals who understood warfare at a level beyond the ordinary. The question becomes, were they actually different in their approach to command, or were they simply different people expressing the same fundamental military genius through different personalities? Some scholars have suggested that Patton's flamboyance served a real purpose, that the men under his command needed to see him, to believe in his invincibility, to feel that he was leading them toward victory with absolute certainty. Krueger's reserve, by that same logic, served his men differently. They knew he was studying every detail, calculating every factor, leaving nothing to chance. If Patton gave them the confidence of invincibility, Krueger gave them the confidence that their general had thought through every contingency. The irony of the nickname, then, is that it operated on multiple levels. To those who knew Patton well, calling Krueger the Patton of the Pacific was either a compliment to Patton's tactical genius or a backhanded acknowledgement that Krueger was delivering Patton's level of results without Patton's theatricality. But to those who looked more carefully at what Krueger actually accomplished in the Pacific theater, the swift, crushing efficiency of his operations, the way he seemed to appear in unexpected places with overwhelming force, the comparison made a different kind of sense. It was saying that here was another general of the First Order, another officer who understood the deep grammar of warfare, another commander who could move armies and break enemy resistance with calculated precision. The difference was simply that Krueger did it quietly, almost invisibly, which perhaps only made the results more remarkable. There was a stillness to Krueger that some of his officers found unsettling at first. He did not radiate the kind of kinetic energy that Patton carried into every room. He would sit at a map table for hours, sometimes not speaking, sometimes asking a single quiet question that reframed an entire operation. Officers who expected a general to lead through force of personality found themselves instead in the presence of a man who led through intellect and preparation. And over time, that kind of leadership proved its own kind of powerful. Men came to trust Krueger not because he had inspired them with grand visions, but because, time and again, his plans worked. The enemy was where he said they would be. The supply lines held. The timing was perfect. The casualties, while still terrible, were lower than they might have been because Krueger had thought through every factor that might save lives. It is worth pausing here on that distinction because it speaks to something often unexamined in military history. We tend to celebrate the visible, the dramatic, the personality-driven leadership that can be easily converted into narrative and memory, but the unglamorous work of logistics, of coordination, of careful timing and meticulous planning, this is often what actually determines the outcome of battles. And Krueger understood this perhaps better than any officer of his generation, where Patton won through the overwhelming force of personality and the almost reckless daring of his tactical schemes. Krueger won through systems, through planning, through the invisible architecture that made the visible victory possible. In that sense, the nickname inverts its own meaning. Patton was the more famous general, the more celebrated one, the one whose name people remember, but Krueger, in his quiet way, was perhaps the more complete military mind. He had what Patton had, the tactical brilliance, the operational sense, the understanding of how to move armies. But he also had something Patton lacked, the patience, the humility, the willingness to subordinate himself entirely to the mission at hand. By early 1942, as the war in the Pacific gathered momentum and American forces began their slow, costly island-hopping campaign across vast stretches of ocean, the Army's high command faced a peculiar organizational problem. They needed a commander who could manage not merely battles, but the orchestration of entire operations, a general who could blend logistical precision with combat decisiveness, who understood that victory in the Pacific's immense theater demanded something more subtle than headlong assault. General Douglas MacArthur, already ensconced in Australia and commanding Allied operations in the Southwest Pacific area, needed a right hand, a steady executive who could handle the unglamorous machinery of war, while MacArthur managed the political and strategic dimensions. That man was Walter Krueger. The call came quietly, without fanfare. In 1943, as Krueger approached his 60s, the years of steady staff work and careful observation seemed to culminate in a single appointment. He was transferred to the Pacific Theater and given command of the Sixth Army, a newly formed organization that existed largely on paper, a shell waiting to be filled with divisions, corps, and all the sinews of modern warfare. For a man who had spent the previous years commanding the Third Army in stateside war games, who had grown accustomed to the orderly rhythms of the continental United States, the transition to the Pacific represented something like a second career. The climate alone was a shock. From the measured autumn of Georgia, where he had refined his operational theories against imaginary enemies on familiar ground, he stepped into the suffocating humidity of the Southwest Pacific, where the enemy was neither imaginary nor distant. What made this appointment so significant, though it would be largely forgotten by history, was the implicit recognition of Krueger's particular gifts. MacArthur needed someone who could build an army from scratch, who understood the cascading logistics of amphibious operations, who would not be seduced by the temptations of recklessness. The general who arrived in the theatre was 62 years old, lean and spare, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades learning his craft through study and repetition rather than through dramatic flourishes. He carried with him notebooks filled with observations, a mind stocked with military history, and a patience that came from knowing that time, managed correctly, could be as much a weapon as any gun. The Sixth Army's first challenge was simply to exist as a coherent force. Units arrived piecemeal from the States, many of them poorly trained, some of them fresh from training camps where the instructors themselves were still learning. Supply lines had to be established across thousands of miles of ocean. Staff officers had to be organized into functional sections. The business of creating an army, the seemingly invisible work of establishing supply dumps, training schedules, medical infrastructure, and communication networks, fell largely to Krueger. It was not the sort of work that would ever appear in a general's memoirs with dramatic chapter headings, yet it was the true foundation upon which every successful operation would rest. The contrast between Krueger and MacArthur, his immediate superior, could hardly have been more pronounced. MacArthur was the strategic visionary, the figure who would dominate the headlines and the historical consciousness of the Pacific War. He was theatrical, ambitious, keenly aware of his place in history. When he made decisions, they often carried a sense of drama, of grand purpose. Krueger, by comparison, was almost invisible. He did not court the press. He did not speak in the ornate, quotable phrases that MacArthur seemed to produce effortlessly. Instead, he moved through the various headquarters and supply bases with a methodical deliberation, asking questions, reviewing plans, pushing his subordinates toward excellence through example rather than exhortation. One might wonder what it was like to serve as the operational commander under someone of MacArthur's towering ego and public profile, and the honest answer is that Krueger seemed to accept this arrangement with equanimity. He was not a man who needed recognition to drive him. The work itself was sufficient. The relationship between the two men was never particularly warm, though it was invariably professional. MacArthur made the decisions about where the Sixth Army would fight and when. Krueger determined how. This division of labor, informal as it was, seemed to work. MacArthur could dream his grand strategic visions, the return to the Philippines, the westward drive toward Japan, while Krueger quietly worked out the arithmetic of how to make those visions real. There is something poignant in contemplating this partnership. MacArthur would be remembered as the architect of the Pacific War's strategy, while Krueger would fade into obscurity, known only to military historians and students of World War II who took the time to look beneath the obvious narratives. The Sixth Army that Krueger took command of in 1943 was positioned to play the crucial role in MacArthur's grand strategy. The plan, in its broad strokes, was to move northwestward from Australia and New Guinea, using amphibious assaults to bypass heavily defended Japanese positions, gradually working toward the Philippines and ultimately toward Japan itself. The tempo of operations would be determined by logistics, by the availability of ships and troops, by the condition of airfields and supply depots. In other words, it would be determined by the kind of detailed, methodical planning that was Krueger's forte. As he settled into his new command, surrounded by maps of unfamiliar islands and the weight of responsibility for thousands of soldiers he had yet to meet, he must have understood that the next years would test everything he had learned across 5 decades of military service. When Krueger arrived in the Southwest Pacific in September of 1942, he stepped into a theater of war that bore almost no resemblance to the European campaigns he might have imagined. The Japanese had swept across vast territories with terrifying speed, and now the Americans faced a choice that would define the entire Pacific strategy: push northward through New Guinea, or island hop across the Central Pacific. MacArthur chose the former path, and Krueger, as commander of the Sixth Army, would carry that burden forward into terrain that seemed designed to break men, equipment, and resolve alike. New Guinea was not a battlefield. It was a place where battlefields might eventually exist if one survived long enough to reach them. The island itself, over 1,500 miles long, was a twisted geography of mountains and jungles so dense that in places, daylight barely penetrated to the forest floor. Rivers ran every few miles, swollen and unpredictable with seasonal rains. Swamps sprawled endlessly where water and land blurred into a single suffocating medium. The Japanese had fortified certain positions along the coasts, but the real enemy was environment itself, a living, breathing resistance that killed more slowly, but perhaps more inevitably, than enemy bullets. The climate was relentless heat and humidity that seemed to squeeze moisture from the very air around you. Temperatures routinely climbed into the 90s, sometimes higher, and the humidity made breathing feel like drawing in wet cloth. A man's uniform would never dry. His skin would begin to macerate within days, becoming vulnerable to fungal infections that no amount of washing could prevent. Supplies rotted in the dampness. Ammunition grew corrosion on its casings. Radio equipment failed with maddening frequency. For a general like Krueger, obsessed with precision and preparation, the swamp itself was an opponent that resisted all the methodical planning in the world. And then, there were the diseases. Malaria was perhaps the most notorious, carried by mosquitoes that seemed to exist in incomprehensible abundance. A soldier could take his quinine pills, apply his mosquito netting, do everything the medical officers prescribed, and still wake one morning burning with fever, his body racked by chills that made his teeth chatter uncontrollably. Dysentery ran rampant through the ranks. Dengue fever struck down men who had survived combat. Scrub typhus, carried by mites in the undergrowth, appeared without warning. Fungal infections spread in the constant dampness. Athlete's foot, ringworm, jungle rot. Conditions that seem almost trivial until you consider that when an infection covered significant portions of a soldier's body, he became too weak to fight, too feverish to stand watch. At times, more men sat in field hospitals struggling with disease than stood in fighting positions facing the Japanese. This was the grueling arithmetic of the New Guinea campaign, a mathematics of attrition that favored neither side but simply consumed men and resources at a steady, grinding rate. Krueger understood this dynamic with the clarity of a commander who had studied logistics closely and learned from the Great War's lessons. He knew that victory in this environment would not come from brilliant maneuvers or sudden breakthroughs, but from the patient accumulation of supply, the careful distribution of forces, and the willingness to move slowly enough that the jungle itself did not become your greatest casualty maker. The terrain forced amphibious warfare into its most fundamental, difficult form. The American forces would have to land on beaches that were often flanked by mangrove swamps or dense jungle, establish a beachhead, then push inland through vegetation so thick that visibility sometimes extended only a few yards. Japanese defenders, preparing defensive positions in this same landscape, had a natural advantage. They knew the terrain, had prepared it, and could inflict maximum casualties on advancing Americans who had to move through jungle paths that became obvious ambush points. Krueger's approach was methodical, perhaps even glacial, by the standards of commanders hungry for rapid victory. He would gather intelligence from natives, from scouting parties, and from aerial reconnaissance. He would accumulate supplies at forward positions, building supply lines that had to travel hundreds of miles by sea and through difficult terrain. He would position artillery far back from his assault troops, creating overlapping fields of fire designed to minimize American casualties and overwhelm Japanese defenses with weight of firepower. Then, finally, he would move, not with the theatrical dash that some generals favored, but with the careful, relentless momentum of a great machine being wound up and released. This was not exciting warfare to observe or to chronicle. Journalists accompanying the Sixth Army would find themselves sitting in camps, watching engineers hack roads through jungle, watching supply details organize rations, watching soldiers practice amphibious landings on small beaches that had been cleared for training. The actual fighting, when it came, was often brief and brutal, compressed into hours or days, followed by long periods of consolidation and preparation for the next movement. Do you wonder how soldiers endured this? Not just the combat, but the relentless, grinding monotony of advance through hostile territory, where every inch of progress felt purchased with some invisible price. The answer lay partly in training, partly in discipline, and partly in the fact that what seemed like slow progress to observers watching from comfortable distances in Washington or Hawaii was actually movement at the very edge of what was physically and logistically possible. Krueger pushed northward up the coast and across the Owen Stanley Mountains, a range so formidable that some thought it impassable until soldiers began proving otherwise, one exhausting day at a time. Supply lines stretched back down the coast to bases that had themselves been carved out of jungle only months before. At every step, every advance was measured in casualties, not just combat casualties, though those were substantial, but disease casualties, accident casualties, the slow erosion of strength that came from fighting the environment as much as the enemy. What one notices, when examining this campaign in detail, is how precisely Krueger's temperament matched the demands of the situation. A more aggressive commander might have pushed faster, accepting higher casualties in hopes of achieving breakthrough moments. A more cautious one might have stalled, waiting for supplies that would never be quite abundant enough, seeking an ideal that could never materialize in such circumstances. Krueger found the narrow path between these extremes, moving neither recklessly nor timidly, but with the steady determination of a man who understood that victory here would belong to whoever could sustain effort the longest without breaking. The jungle accepted this approach without comment. The disease continued its work. The Japanese fought with their usual combination of discipline and suicidal determination, and slowly, incrementally, the Americans advanced. By early 1944, the grinding campaign through New Guinea had taught Krueger something essential about island warfare in the Pacific. It was not merely about taking ground, though taking ground mattered deeply. It was about timing. It was about understanding where your enemy expected you to strike, and then striking elsewhere. It was about moving faster than conventional military wisdom suggested was prudent, and about trusting your preparation enough to move swiftly when the moment arrived. The Admiralty Islands lay north of New Guinea, a cluster of volcanic atolls rising from the Bismarck Sea, strategically positioned to cut Japanese supply lines and to serve as a stepping stone toward the Philippines. The Japanese garrison, while not massive, was entrenched and expecting a deliberate American assault. They had built their defenses in the obvious places. They had prepared their strongest positions where logic suggested an invader would land. But Krueger, working with his staff in those humid command tents illuminated by flickering lamps, saw something the Japanese did not quite see. What if, he wondered, timing and surprise could accomplish what brute force alone might require months to secure? The operation began in late February of 1944, with a reconnaissance in force. A small contingent of American troops landed on Haiane Harbor, ostensibly to scout the beaches and gather intelligence. But it was more than that. It was a feint, a subtle chess move in the larger game. The real intention was to probe Japanese reactions, to test their alert status, to discover whether they would commit forces prematurely or hold their ground. Krueger had calculated that if the Japanese garrison could be convinced that a major invasion was imminent, they might overextend themselves or concentrate their strength in predictable ways. The feint worked with a precision that bordered on the uncanny. Japanese commanders, believing they were facing the opening moves of a full-scale assault, began moving troops and artillery. They shifted their deployment from a distributed defensive posture to one more concentrated and rigid. And then, on March 2nd, Krueger struck with his real blow. A much larger American force landed not where the Japanese had fully prepared their defenses, but where they had weakened their grip in order to respond to the threatened attack elsewhere. It was a textbook demonstration of what later military theorists would call operational maneuver. The Japanese garrison, suddenly finding itself engaged by a much larger force than they had expected to face in that particular location, found its prepared positions already outflanked by circumstance. What might have required weeks of costly assault, with waves of men crossing fire-swept beaches and then grinding inland through jungle fortifications, was accomplished with remarkable swiftness. The Americans secured the airfield at Manus Island within days. The Japanese, unable to concentrate their full strength in time to mount an effective counterattack, either fell back into the interior or were swiftly overwhelmed. The seizure of the Admiralty Islands, when historians later wrote about the Pacific War, received a fraction of the attention lavished on the more famous landings. Leyte would be remembered, Iwo Jima would be remembered, Okinawa would be remembered, but the Admiralty Islands, accomplished in a swift and graceful operation with minimal casualties, faded into the background of popular memory. Yet among military professionals, it became studied as an example of what could be achieved through superior intelligence, precise timing, and a commander's willingness to trust his own judgment against conventional expectations. Krueger's role in this operation was, characteristically, to plan it in meticulous detail and then to trust his subordinates to execute it. He was not the sort of commander to stand on a beach and be photographed wading ashore. He was not the sort to make grandiloquent speeches over radio channels. Instead, he was in the command post, monitoring the reports as they filtered in, ready to adjust orders if circumstances demanded it, but essentially confident that the preparation had been thorough enough to allow events to unfold as designed. The operation also revealed something about the geography of command in the Pacific. Krueger's Sixth Army was operating under the overall authority of General Douglas MacArthur, and while MacArthur received the strategic credit for the broad outlines of the campaign, it was often Krueger who translated those strategies into the meticulous operational plans that made them possible. MacArthur would announce the objective. Krueger would calculate how to achieve it with the minimum expenditure of American lives. It was, in some ways, a complementary relationship, though not always an easy one. Consider for a moment what the Admiralty Islands operation actually demanded. It required detailed knowledge of Japanese defensive dispositions. It required understanding not just where the enemy was, but how they thought, how they would react to false information, how they would allocate their limited resources. It required coordinating naval support, air cover, and the timing of the amphibious landings themselves. It required trust in junior commanders and enlisted men who would execute orders in chaotic conditions under fire. It required the kind of quiet confidence that comes only from long preparation and deep study. The swiftness of the operation also freed up American resources that could be committed to the next phase of the campaign. The Japanese, meanwhile, found their supply lines further disrupted and their capacity to reinforce or resupply their garrisons in the Philippines weakened. The Admiralty Islands seizure, though it might seem almost incidental when viewed from a certain distance, was actually a crucial link in the chain of operations that would eventually lead to the Philippines themselves. Without secure control of those waters and that airfield, the journey northward would have been far more difficult and far more costly. And so, on a humid night in the Pacific, maps were studied and adjusted, new objectives were marked. The machinery of the Sixth Army, now proven in its ability to move with both speed and precision, began preparing for the next leap forward. Krueger, meanwhile, was already thinking ahead. The Admiralty Islands were secured. The question now became, what next, and how? And so Krueger's moment came, in October of 1944, when the vast machinery of the Pacific War turned toward the Philippines. After the grinding trials of New Guinea, after the fever swamps and the malaria and the endless calculations of supply, the Sixth Army received its most ambitious order yet. They would land on Leyte, an island in the central Philippines, and they would do it with a scale and complexity that would test every element of Krueger's methodical genius. The landings were set for October 20th. Imagine the scene in the days before. thousands upon thousands of men, packed into transport ships, sitting in the humid darkness with their rifles and their ammunition and their fear. These were the young and the nervous and the seasoned alike, all of them bound for an island that had been held by the Japanese for years, fortified and prepared and waiting. The naval gunfire support vessels moved into position offshore, their great guns ready to soften the beaches. The minesweepers worked through the night, clearing channels through waters that the enemy had seeded with explosives, each sweep a tense dance with the possibility of catastrophe. In the pre-dawn hours, the men were called topside, and they stood on the decks in the darkness and felt the weight of what was coming. The landings themselves, when they came, were almost eerily smooth at first. The initial assault waves met lighter resistance than the planners had feared, and Krueger's meticulous coordination of the amphibious assault showed its worth. The men poured across the beaches, establishing beachheads, pushing inland with surprising speed. Behind them came the supply trains, the ammunition dumps, the field hospitals, the vast, unglamorous apparatus that Krueger had spent weeks arranging. Every truck that rolled off a landing craft, every crate of rations, every gallon of gasoline had been accounted for in the calculations he had reviewed in his tent. The logistics were holding, the system was working. But even as the American soldiers were driving inland, even as the beachhead was expanding and the initial objectives were being secured, something far more dramatic was unfolding out on the water. The Japanese Navy, what remained of it, was converging on Leyte Gulf. You might wonder then, what was the tactical situation that confronted the naval forces that October, and how did it shape the land campaign that Krueger was directing? The answer lies in the complexity of the moment itself. While Krueger's troops were establishing their foothold, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was beginning, a vast naval engagement that would become the largest naval battle in history, a clash involving battleships and carriers and cruisers and destroyers, a collision that would unfold across multiple fronts over days of fierce, exhausting combat. Krueger could not control the sea battle. That was Admiral Halsey's domain, and Admiral Nimitz's, and there were complexities of strategy and command authority that Krueger, a soldier, would have understood in principle, but not in practice. Yet the naval battle and the land campaign were inseparable. If the Japanese fleet succeeded in breaking through to the landing beaches, if they managed to land their own reinforcements or bombard the beachhead with their big guns, everything that Krueger had so carefully orchestrated could dissolve. His men could be trapped. His supply lines could be severed. His army, so meticulously brought ashore, could become a marooned, desperate force on a hostile island. So while the battles raged offshore, the massive exchanges of gunfire, the carrier strikes, the nighttime torpedo runs through waters turned to chaos, Krueger remained focused on what he could control. He pushed his divisions inland. He orchestrated the landing of additional forces. He ensured that supplies continued to flow across the beaches. He monitored the airfields, knowing that air superiority was as essential to holding Leyte as naval superiority. In the quiet of his command post, with the thunder of distant guns providing an unnerving soundtrack, he made decision after decision, each one calculated to entrench the American presence on the island, to make it impossible for the Japanese to dislodge them, regardless of what happened on the water. The naval battle, as it happened, went the way of the Americans. Despite some tense moments, despite some Japanese successes that could have been catastrophic, the American forces held. Japanese attempts to exploit the situation, to use the cover of night to slip destroyers and cruisers through to the landing beaches, were thwarted by American destroyers in desperate, close-range engagements. The Japanese fleet withdrew, damaged and depleted, and Leyte remained in American hands. The beachhead was secure. Krueger's army had won its foothold in the Philippines, but securing the beachhead was only the beginning. The Japanese forces on Leyte were substantial, perhaps 70,000 men, entrenched and determined to defend their island to the last. The terrain was rugged, cut through with jungles and rivers and swamps, not unlike the New Guinea campaign but compressed, more intense, more desperate. The Japanese command on the island understood that the fall of Leyte might signal the beginning of the end for their position in the Philippines, and they poured in reinforcements, sending transport ships down from the north, accepting terrible losses from air attacks to land fresh troops and supplies. Krueger understood this, and he prepared his Sixth Army for a grinding, prolonged campaign. He brought in his divisions methodically, positioned them carefully, planned attacks with characteristic precision. The tempo of operations quickened. The battles became more frequent. Men who had just landed began to know the names of their units' kills and losses, began to understand the rhythm of attack and counterattack. Supply lines that had seemed so carefully arranged were now being tested by the furious consumption of ammunition. Hospitals filled with wounded. The initial momentum of the landing gave way to the slower, harder work of conquest. And still, overhead, the air war continued. American fighters and bombers attempted to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing Leyte, while Japanese aircraft, growing fewer each day, flew desperate sorties in attempts to disrupt the landing operations or attack the ships offshore. The sky above Leyte was never truly quiet. There was always the sound of engines, the distant percussion of anti-aircraft fire, the occasional glimpse of a dogfight occurring too high to follow clearly. In this vast, complex dance of land, sea, and air warfare, Krueger represented a different kind of leadership than the flamboyant, impulsive style that sometimes captured headlines. His was the leadership of the careful orchestrator, the man who ensured that all the elements functioned together, who understood that battles were not won by heroic cavalry charges, but by logistics, by coordination, by the patient accumulation of advantage. At Leyte, that approach was vindicated. The landings succeeded, the beachhead held, the campaign proceeded according to plan, more or less, despite the complexities and the chaos of actual warfare. It was a triumph of method over improvisation, a vindication of Krueger's way of making war. The waters around Leyte had barely stilled before Krueger's eyes turned north toward Luzon, the crown jewel of the Philippines, where Manila waited with all its strategic promise and all its terrible complexity. The island was no longer simply a military objective on a map. It had become the symbol of liberation itself, the place where Filipino citizens looked toward the horizon expecting rescue, expecting American soldiers to walk their streets and restore what the Japanese occupation had taken. But between the beaches and that dream lay terrain that would test every ounce of Krueger's methodical patience, every reserve of his casualty-conscious command philosophy. The Luzon landscape was nothing like the relatively open terrain of Leyte. Here were mountains, the Cordillera Central rising like a spine down the island's north, steep and unforgiving, cloaked in thick forest where the canopy was so dense that noon felt like dusk. Japanese defenders, numbering perhaps 200,000 troops, had retreated into these highlands and fortified positions, knowing they could not hold the lowlands against American naval superiority. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, one of Japan's finest tactical minds, had drawn up plans for a protracted mountain campaign, a deliberate strategy of slow attrition designed to exact the maximum cost in American blood before the inevitable defeat. He understood, as did Krueger, that terrain itself could be weaponized, that mountains could slow an army as effectively as any well-placed artillery. Krueger's landing plan for Luzon, executed in January 1945, showed his characteristic precision. Rather than assault Manila directly, which would have been the obvious, straightforward route, he landed at Lingayen Gulf in the northwest, a move that allowed him to encircle Japanese forces and begin a methodical advance that would progressively isolate pockets of resistance. The approach was reminiscent of his thinking throughout the New Guinea campaign. Do not meet strength with frontal assault, but rather position yourself such that the enemy must either fight at disadvantage or retreat into terrain where supply lines would fail. It was the thinking of a chess master, perhaps, translated into the language of warfare. What followed was 3 months of grinding mountain fighting, the kind of campaign that rarely makes headlines in histories of the war because it lacks the dramatic flourish of a sudden breakthrough, the kind of fighting where the true shape of a commander's character becomes visible. Krueger's troops were advancing through some of the harshest terrain in the Pacific Theater, mountains rising 7,000 feet, ravines filled with dense tropical vegetation, weather that alternated between sweltering heat and torrential rains that turned trails into rivers of mud. Disease was as much an enemy as the Japanese. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery claimed casualties that, while less visible than battle wounds, were no less destructive to an army's fighting strength. The Japanese fought with their customary determination, but Yamashita's strategy demanded something different from them than the banzai charges of earlier campaigns. This was deliberate resistance, carefully managed, designed to inflict maximum casualties on advancing Americans while preserving Japanese strength for the next defensive line. They dug themselves into mountain strongholds, created interlocking fields of fire from ridgelines that overlooked valleys, and waited with the patience of soldiers who knew their cause was lost but refused to accept it quickly. One might wonder, in the quiet hours of contemplation, what thoughts occupied the minds of those defenders. Did they see their sacrifice as meaningful or merely inevitable? Krueger's response to this grinding resistance was characteristic. Where a general less disciplined might have pushed harder, expended more lives to achieve breakthrough faster, Krueger resisted the pressure from MacArthur's headquarters, which chafed at the pace of advance. He coordinated artillery carefully, ensured that units did not attack until adequate support could be brought forward, rotated exhausted divisions out of the line for rest and recovery, rather than grinding them to uselessness. His battle plans emphasized methodical reduction of Japanese positions, using enveloping movements to render strongpoints untenable, forcing the enemy to abandon fortifications rather than die defending them. It was, in its own way, a more humane form of warfare, not because he was soft, but because he understood that every casualty represented a soldier who would not return home, and that unnecessary losses served no strategic purpose. The cost, even with this careful approach, was still substantial. American casualties mounted steadily, thousands killed, many more wounded, the steady arithmetic of attrition that no amount of tactical brilliance could entirely avoid. The Japanese, for their part, suffered far more catastrophically, with tens of thousands killed in the mountains, their supply lines severed, their situation becoming more hopeless with each passing week. One might reflect, listening to these numbers in the quiet darkness, on the terrible mathematics of warfare, that even when a commander seeks to minimize bloodshed, warfare itself is fundamentally wasteful, fundamentally tragic, a human endeavor in which even the most carefully planned actions result in suffering that cannot be entirely prevented or foreseen. What made Krueger's approach distinctive was not that he avoided casualties that would have been impossible, but that he never accepted unnecessary ones as the price of speed or glory. He understood, perhaps more deeply than many commanders of his generation, that an army was ultimately composed of individual human beings, and that each decision to attack or advance had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. His subordinates would later recall that Krueger visited hospitals, that he looked at the wounded, that the human cost of warfare was something he carried with him, something he took seriously in ways that manifested in his operational decisions. As the weeks wore on, Japanese positions collapsed progressively. The mountains, which had seemed to offer hope of a prolonged defense, became increasingly isolated as American forces cut supply lines and surrounded Japanese strongpoints. By March, the major organized Japanese resistance began to crumble, though pockets of determined defenders would continue fighting in the remote highlands for weeks afterward, some even continuing resistance after the war's official end. The campaign was not swift or dramatic, but it was devastatingly effective. By the time it concluded, the Japanese presence on Luzon had been reduced from a coherent defensive force to scattered remnants, unable to mount any meaningful counteroffensive. Krueger's reputation among his troops, built across the campaigns of the previous year, had only deepened as a result of Luzon. They understood, perhaps inchoately, that their commander was not interested in winning by spending their lives wastefully, that the careful planning and methodical advances he insisted upon, while sometimes frustrating in their slowness, kept them alive more effectively than any amount of aggressive tactics could. It was a form of leadership that would never make headlines, that would never inspire parades or poetry, but that represented a kind of wisdom, the understanding that true command excellence lies not in dramatic gestures, but in the unglamorous work of preserving your soldiers while achieving your objectives. As the Sixth Army pressed deeper into Luzon, the mountains began to give way, and the roads ahead grew straighter. By late January 1945, Krueger's forward units were advancing rapidly southward toward the capital. Manila lay ahead, the heart of the Philippines, a city of 500,000 souls, whose liberation had been promised by General MacArthur himself years before, when he waded ashore at Leyte Gulf. The general had spoken those words with absolute certainty: "I shall return." Now, as Krueger's columns drew toward the city's northern suburbs, the meaning of that promise was about to collide with the brutal realities of urban warfare. The approach itself was deceptively swift. Japanese resistance had been crumbling under the steady pressure of American advances, and soldiers on the road felt the electricity of being close to a great city, close to what they believed would be a triumphant moment. But Krueger, studying his maps in the evenings, understood something that the young men in the forward positions might not have grasped. Cities, he knew from his reading of history and doctrine, were different. They were labyrinths. Streets became killing grounds, rubble became fortifications, civilians became complications, and time, that precious commodity that had favored him in the jungles, would slow dramatically once the fighting moved into Manila's dense urban maze. What none of the American soldiers could have anticipated as they approached the city's outskirts in early February was the deliberate destruction that Japanese commanders had already ordered. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese commander in the Philippines, had actually ordered the evacuation of Manila. He did not intend to make a major stand there, but naval officers under Rear Admiral Iwabuchi, proud and defiant, refused to yield. They sealed themselves inside the city's walls and buildings, and they intended to fight to the last man. More significantly, and more tragically, they made a conscious decision to destroy much of Manila rather than see it fall intact to American hands. Water pipes were cut, public buildings were torched, bridges were wired with explosives, and the civilian population, caught between two armies, was herded into buildings that would become death traps. The first American soldiers to enter Manila's northern districts in the second week of February found a city already burning. Smoke rose in columns from a dozen quarters. The sound of gunfire was sporadic at first, then constant. Krueger established his command post south of the city, careful to remain far enough back to maintain perspective and receive reports accurately. He could not afford to be drawn into the tactical details of urban combat. That work belonged to his division commanders, to the men with rifles and grenades moving through the streets. His responsibility was to oversee the broader operation, to ensure that the pressure was sustained, that supplies flowed forward, that communications remained clear. But even at a distance, even through the reports that filtered back to his tent each evening, he could sense that something terrible was unfolding in Manila's streets. The Japanese defenders numbered perhaps 6,000. They were holed up in fortified positions throughout the city, particularly in government buildings, schools, churches, and the walled district known as Intramuros, where colonial Spanish buildings had been converted into pillboxes and strongpoints. American commanders, eager to minimize casualties to their own men, called in artillery strikes and air support, and this is where the moral weight begins to settle most heavily. Artillery shells do not discriminate between military targets and civilian presence. They strike buildings, they destroy homes, they kill anyone sheltering inside them. By one estimate, somewhere between 100,000 and 240,000 civilians died in the battle for Manila, most of them not from combat, but from the deliberate destruction ordered by Japanese officers, from the shellings and bombings meant to dislodge the defenders, or from the brutal tactics employed by desperate soldiers with nowhere left to retreat. The fighting in Intramuros was particularly savage. American soldiers, advancing street by street, building by building, often had to call in artillery support because Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, preferring to fight until killed. Flamethrowers were used to clear bunkers. Grenades were thrown into collapsed buildings where Japanese soldiers might be hiding. The ancient walls of Intramuros, which had stood for 300 years, were reduced to rubble in a matter of weeks. Spanish churches were shattered, libraries burned. The National Museum was damaged. Everything that made Manila a center of culture and learning became either a target or a casualty. Krueger, reading the casualty reports and the damage assessments, had to carry a particular burden. He had ordered the assault. He had set the strategy that led to this moment. He was not a man given to public displays of emotion, certainly not when compared to Patton's theatrical pronouncements, but the mounting toll of civilian deaths would have weighed on him, as any thoughtful military commander should be weighed upon. Could it have been done differently? Should the assault have been slower, more cautious, given time for negotiations or civilian evacuation? These are the questions that haunt military history. The answer, in retrospect, seems impossibly complicated. Speed saved American lives. Caution might have prolonged the agony of the city's inhabitants. Different choices would have led to different outcomes, some better, some perhaps worse. By early March, after roughly a month of fighting, Manila was secure. The Japanese defenders were dead. The city was in American hands. General MacArthur made his triumphant return, walking through the ruined streets as he had promised he would. Photographs show him, characteristically, in the center of the frame, acknowledging the cheers of Filipino civilians who had emerged from hiding. But those same photographs, if one looks closely, show a city that has been fundamentally transformed. Buildings that had existed for centuries were now hollow shells. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash and rubble. The cultural heart of the Philippines had been violently excised. Krueger did not make much of the moment publicly. He was not there for the photographs. He was already thinking ahead, already planning the next phase. Remaining Japanese forces still held much of Luzon. There were still islands to be taken, still enemies to engage. The war was not over, and even as MacArthur basked in the glow of Manila's capture, Krueger was organizing supply convoys for the next push inland, where Japanese soldiers, entrenched in the mountains, awaited. This was his way. The dramatic moment passed, and he moved forward, always focused on the next objective. Yet the liberation of Manila, for all its strategic necessity, remained a stain on what had otherwise been a relatively economical campaign. Krueger's meticulous planning, his attention to logistics and supply, his ability to move armies with precision and care, none of these virtues could entirely shield him from the moral gravity of urban combat. A city had been destroyed, nominally in the process of liberating it. Tens of thousands of civilians lay dead. And if the American public, distant and safe, celebrated the strategic victory, that celebration existed in a different moral universe from the one Krueger inhabited when he reviewed the casualty lists. A thoughtful military mind, faced with such knowledge, cannot simply set it aside. It remains a permanent weight, a permanent question about the choices made and the roads not taken. Yet there existed between Krueger and his commanding general, Douglas MacArthur, a peculiar tension that would define much of the Pacific campaign, a friction born not from conflict or disrespect, but from fundamentally different temperaments pursuing the same distant objective through divergent means. MacArthur was a figure of theatre and vision, a man who understood that war was not merely the movement of armies across terrain, but the movement of imaginations across newsprint and radio waves. He carried himself as though history was watching, because he believed, with some justification, that it was. Krueger, by contrast, moved through the war as a man moves through fog, carefully, methodically, watching his feet rather than the horizon, concerned always with the next ridge, the next supply line, the next casualty list, that might be shortened by one more hour of preparation. This difference manifested itself most acutely in what might be called the MacArthur impulse toward the audacious, the bold stroke executed with theatrical timing. The general commanding the Southwest Pacific area possessed a gift for seeing not what was possible, but what could be made to seem inevitable through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. He dreamed of cutting across vast stretches of ocean, landing deep behind enemy lines, of operations that would encircle entire armies and render them helpless. And often enough, he was right. His instinct for the jugular, his willingness to take calculated risks with incomplete intelligence, his faith in the power of surprise and speed, these qualities had saved countless American lives by shortening campaigns and outmaneuvering an enemy who expected more cautious, deliberate advances. Yet Krueger represented something equally vital, though far less photogenic, the belief that careful planning, conservative casualty estimates, and methodical preparation were not obstacles to victory, but its prerequisites. Where MacArthur saw an enemy to be outflanked, Krueger saw terrain to be understood, supply chains to be secured, and men who would need to be fed, clothed, sheltered, and provided with ammunition in quantities calculated months in advance. He was the sort of commander who troubled himself with drainage patterns in jungle valleys because he knew that disease would kill more soldiers than enemy bullets if camps were placed carelessly. He was the man who studied the carrying capacity of every transport ship and the caloric requirements of men marching through equatorial heat, the officer who understood that an army of 80,000 was helpless if it outran its supply by a single day's march. MacArthur understood this intellectually. He was no fool, and his plans were never reckless in their conception. Yet there was always in his thinking a certain optimism, perhaps, or faith in the capacity of brilliant execution to overcome logistical constraints. He believed that a sufficiently bold operation, executed by men of sufficient quality, could succeed even on the knife's edge. Krueger believed that the knife's edge was where most men fell, and that preventing the fall was the general's sacred obligation. The working relationship between them, therefore, developed into an intricate dance of yielding and insisting, of recommendation and acquiescence. Krueger was not a man who openly resisted his commanding general. That was not his nature, and certainly not his position, but he was a man who offered alternatives, who suggested phases and stages, who proposed that operations be preceded by additional reconnaissance, additional preparation, additional time. And MacArthur, to his considerable credit, usually listened. He would grow impatient at times. There are indications of that in the historical record. Commanders under such constraints often do. Yet he seems to have come to respect, or at least to acknowledge, the soundness of Krueger's caution. Consider the landings in the Philippines themselves. MacArthur had envisioned the return to the archipelago as both a strategic necessity and a personal redemption, the fulfillment of a promise made years earlier. "I shall return," a promise that had become legend. But the detailed planning, the actual mechanics of putting hundreds of thousands of men ashore on islands held by a determined enemy, the coordination of naval forces and ground forces and air support, the provision of shelter and water and food for those hundreds of thousands in the tropical heat. This fell to Krueger. He was the architect of the actual landing at Leyte, the man who determined how many ships would carry how many men, to which beaches, at which precise hours of which days. He was the one who calculated whether the air superiority would hold, whether the supply ships could arrive fast enough, whether the medical personnel were sufficient for the expected casualty rate. It is a peculiar feature of warfare that the most visible decisions are often made by men for whom visibility is secondary, while the men who ensure those decisions can actually be executed rarely receive credit for the fact that they did not result in catastrophe. MacArthur made the grand gestures and reaped the public recognition. Krueger ensured that the soldiers who followed those gestures did not starve or die of malaria in the attempt. If the contrast between their temperaments sometimes created friction, it was a creative friction, the productive tension between ambition and prudence. There were moments, certainly, when Krueger's caution frustrated his superiors' grander impulses. There were operations that MacArthur wished to execute more swiftly, campaigns he wanted to conclude more dramatically. Yet what is striking in retrospect is how rarely Krueger's advice proved mistaken. When he urged additional preparation, battles went more smoothly. When he insisted on securing supply lines before advancing further, the advance, when it came, sustained its momentum. The casualties under his command, considered against the scope and scale of the operations he directed, were remarkably light, not through good fortune, but through meticulous calculation and the unglamorous work of ensuring that every soldier had what he needed before he was asked to risk his life. One might speculate, though such speculation ventures into the realm of might have been, that this working relationship served the overall campaign well, precisely because it was not a relationship of total agreement. An army commanded solely by MacArthur's boldness might have achieved quicker territorial gains at the cost of horrific casualties. An army commanded solely by Krueger's caution might have been impeccable in its logistics, but glacial in its advance. Instead, the two men, operating within a framework of mutual respect despite their differences, created something between their opposing instincts, campaigns that moved with sufficient speed to maintain strategic advantage, yet with sufficient care to minimize the waste of human life. This, too, is part of the unglamorous truth of military command, that the officers remembered in history books and celebrated in documentaries are often those who made the grand decisions, while the officers who ensured those decisions could actually be implemented, and without needless suffering, fade into obscurity. Walter Krueger understood this. He seems not to have minded it particularly. He was not a man driven by the hunger for glory. He was a man who took satisfaction in a job well done, in the knowledge that because of his work, more soldiers came home to their families. That was enough. Yet beneath every decisive moment, behind each successful landing and hard-won position held, there lay a quieter architecture entirely, one that Krueger understood with almost mystic clarity, the vast, interlocking machinery of supply and logistics that kept an army not merely moving, but alive. While commanders like Patton became known for their audacious thrusts across open ground, for the flamboyant gesture and the bold declaration, Krueger's true genius expressed itself in the meticulous choreography of getting food, ammunition, fuel, and medicine to men scattered across hundreds of miles of jungle, mountain, and ocean. It is perhaps the least glamorous dimension of warfare, the invisible sinew connecting all visible triumph, and yet without it, every inspiring maneuver dissolves into chaos and hunger. In the Pacific theater, this challenge took on an almost staggering complexity. The distances alone were punishing, supply lines that stretched not merely across continents, but across the widest ocean on Earth, where ships carrying vital cargo could be intercepted, where storms could delay arrival by weeks, where storage facilities had to be carved from virgin jungle or improvised on coral atolls barely large enough to hold them. Krueger grasped, perhaps more acutely than many of his contemporaries, that the Pacific War would not be won by courage or tactical brilliance alone, but by the patient, unglamorous work of moving tonnage. He began his tenure as Sixth Army commander not with stirring speeches, but with a methodical assessment of the supply infrastructure that would be needed, the depots that would have to be established, the harbour facilities that required construction or repair, the transport capacity in ships and trucks and landing craft that could be devoted to the flow of necessities rather than combat troops. His approach was almost Prussian in its orderliness, which is to say it reflected his formative years studying the methods by which Germany's military establishment coordinated its movements. The Germans, despite their ultimate defeat, had constructed remarkable systems for feeding and arming armies across vast territories, and Krueger had absorbed those principles through his decades of private study. He understood that logistics was not merely a support function, but the very foundation upon which strategy rested. An ambitious operation planned without adequate supply lines was not bravery, it was recklessness, and recklessness cost lives. As the Sixth Army moved through New Guinea, then into the Admiralty Islands, then toward the Philippines, Krueger's quartermasters and supply officers labored with a precision that reflected their commanding general's expectations. Supply depots were established according to timetables calculated weeks in advance. Forward airstrips were sited not only for tactical advantage, but with careful consideration of where ammunition and fuel could be most efficiently distributed. Hospitals were positioned so that the sick and wounded would not languish, but could receive care quickly. It sounds straightforward when stated simply, yet in the context of the Pacific, where every installation had to be fought for, carved from jungle, or built from scratch on islands that minutes before had been enemy territory, it represented an almost staggering feat of coordination. The human cost of poor logistics in warfare is easy to forget, buried beneath accounts of glory and heroism. Yet Krueger understood it intimately. Soldiers weakened by hunger were more vulnerable to disease. Men without adequate ammunition could not defend their positions and were more easily overrun. Troops lacking medical supplies suffered higher mortality from wounds that might otherwise have been survivable. By ensuring that his armies were fed, by guaranteeing that ammunition reached forward positions reliably, by creating systems so that the wounded could be evacuated and treated, Krueger was performing an act of care that expressed itself in lives preserved, in units that could fight effectively not from desperation, but from confidence that their needs would be met. His obsession with these details sometimes frustrated his subordinates, or so the records suggest. Officers eager to attack might be delayed by Krueger's insistence that supply lines be secured first, that stockpiles be established, that transportation capacity be verified. Yet his caution was rarely punished. The operations that moved forward under those carefully prepared circumstances succeeded with fewer casualties than similar operations conducted with inadequate preparation. It is a truth that tends to fade from historical memory. We celebrate the bold strike and forget the logistics officer who ensured the striker had food in his belly and ammunition in his pack. The sheer tonnage involved strains the imagination somewhat. By the time the Sixth Army was fully engaged in the Philippines, Krueger's command required the delivery of hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies monthly. Food, of course, billions of calories needed to sustain hundreds of thousands of men in a tropical climate where sweat and exertion burned calories prodigiously. Ammunition in varieties almost impossible to catalogue, artillery shells of different caliber, machine gun rounds, rifle cartridges, grenades, mines, all requiring careful accounting and transport, fuel for vehicles and generators and aircraft, medical supplies from aspirin to plasma, spare parts for weapons and vehicles, clothing that could withstand humidity and mold, replacement uniforms as the tropical environment degraded fabric, equipment lost in combat or accident and requiring replacement. The list expanded endlessly, and yet Krueger's staff tracked it all with ledgers and manifests, ensuring that the right items arrived at the right locations at the right moments. He became known among those who worked closely with him as a general who read supply reports the way poets read verse, with close attention to what each line revealed. A shortfall in ammunition receipts suggested either a transport problem or a logistics bottleneck that needed addressing. A spike in disease cases at a particular location suggested that sanitation measures or medical capacity required reinforcement. High casualty rates that seemed out of proportion to combat intensity might indicate inadequate care facilities or delayed evacuation. Where other generals saw numbers on a page, Krueger saw stories of preparation, success, or failure. And there was something almost tender in his concern for the welfare of his soldiers, though tenderness is not the word he would have recognized or accepted. It expressed itself not in sentiment, but in systems, in the relentless attention to ensuring that men who were fighting and dying in his name would at least have their bellies filled and their wounds treated with dispatch. A more sentimental commander might have offered stirring words. Krueger offered something more durable, the certainty that the machinery of support was working on their behalf, that they were not being thrown into battle abandoned to chaos and chance. The Leyte landings, which will loom large in any account of his command, were actually the culmination of months of logistical preparation that had received little public attention. The beaches where hundreds of thousands of men came ashore had been selected not only for their tactical advantages, but for their capacity to be developed as supply points. The rate at which troops could be landed was constrained not by courage or willingness, but by the number of landing craft available and the speed at which supplies could be moved ashore to sustain them. Krueger understood these constraints with precision, and his plans moved forward with a measured, almost cautious rhythm that reflected his honest assessment of what the supply lines could bear. It was an approach that frustrated those who saw opportunity for greater speed, yet it was this very caution that prevented the supply collapse that might have unraveled the whole operation. His relationship with MacArthur, as has been noted, contained an element of tension rooted partly in temperament and partly in genuine differences about how aggressively the Sixth Army should push forward. Yet even MacArthur, in his eagerness for rapid progress, could not completely override Krueger's sober assessments of what supply capability allowed. The Sixth Army moved as fast as logistics permitted, no faster and no slower, and that measured pace, while it may have prevented the most spectacular gains, ensured that gains, once made, could be held and consolidated. An army that advances faster than its supplies can follow is an army that will eventually be compelled to retreat, a bitter reversal that Krueger's careful planning prevented. Consider the unheralded work that enabled the seizure of the Philippines. Weeks before the first assault troops hit the beaches, supply experts were calculating the tonnage required, the ships needed to transport it, the dock space that would be required to unload it, the storage areas that would need construction or preparation. Road networks were being planned to move supplies forward. Hospitals were being positioned. Fuel depots were being located so that vehicles and aircraft could be refueled as they pushed deeper into contested territory. The entire vast operation moved on rails of logistical calculation as much as military courage, and yet the second remains celebrated, while the first is almost entirely forgotten. It speaks to something fundamental about how we remember and narrate warfare, our hunger for stories of boldness and decisive action, our tendency to overlook the patient work of preparation and supply that makes such action possible. Yet the soldiers in Krueger's command would have understood the connection more clearly. A man eating a hot meal prepared from supplies that arrived reliably understood that someone, somewhere, had worked to make that meal arrive. A wounded soldier evacuated quickly to a hospital that had been positioned thoughtfully understood that logistics had perhaps saved his life. The impact of Krueger's logistical genius was felt not in grand gestures, but in small moments of relative comfort, in the knowledge that the machinery of supply was working on one's behalf. As the campaigns progressed and the Sixth Army moved deeper into the Philippines, this careful orchestration of supply became still more complex, the distances longer, the infrastructure more damaged by the war itself. Yet Krueger's command adapted, improvised, and persisted. It is perhaps his truest claim to greatness, not a moment of brilliant insight, but a sustained commitment to ensuring that the massive organization under his command functioned as a coherent system, that supplies flowed, that needs were anticipated and met, that the human beings who were fighting and dying had at least been given the material foundation upon which effectiveness and survival could rest. As the island campaigns compressed into their final momentum through 1944 and into 1945, Krueger's meticulous mind began to turn toward a problem that loomed ahead with the weight of historical inevitability. Japan itself lay waiting. The homeland, the fortress that could not be bypassed, negotiated with, or starved into submission without a reckoning on the ground that no planner dared underestimate. The mathematics were already unsettling. Every island the Sixth Army had taken, and there had been many now, countless names of places that meant nothing before the war, and little to the world afterward, had exacted a price both in blood and in the stubborn refusal of Japanese forces to surrender even as their position became tactically hopeless. What then might the defense of the Japanese home islands demand? The question hung in the humid Pacific air like an approaching storm. By late 1944, strategic planning had already begun in earnest. Operations planners at MacArthur's headquarters and beyond had started drafting preliminary studies for what would be known as Operation Downfall. The invasion would occur in stages. First would come Operation Olympic, the assault on Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, planned for November of 1945. The beaches selected, the landing zones mapped, the logistics calculated with the same methodical precision that had characterized every Krueger campaign before it. Then, months later, would come Operation Coronet, the assault on the Kanto Plain near Tokyo itself, a landing that would dwarf even the Leyte operation in its scope and ambition. Krueger, as commander of the Sixth Army, knew his role in this grand design. The Sixth Army would bear a significant portion of the burden. His experience in amphibious assault, his reputation for careful preparation, his understanding of the marriage between firepower and supply, all of these would be essential. And yet, unlike some of the more openly eager commanders, Krueger seemed to approach these plans with a kind of sober gravity that reflected not excitement, but the weight of responsibility for the men under his command. The estimates varied, and this is important to hold in mind now, because estimates in wartime are often exercises in necessary uncertainty. Some staff officers calculated that the invasion of Kyushu alone might cost 50,000 American casualties. Others, working with different assumptions about Japanese resistance and the degree of suicide attacks that might be anticipated, proposed figures that were considerably higher. There were whispers of estimates that reached 500,000 or more, though these were treated with considerable skepticism by many professional military minds even then. The Japanese had mobilized nearly the entire civilian population into home defense forces. They had aircraft, diminished though they were. They had fanatics with orders to fight to the last. They had the psychological and geographical advantage of defending their own soil. What would Krueger have done? How would his methodical, casualty-conscious approach have shaped such a campaign? These are the quiet questions that historians have sometimes asked in the decades since, and they are questions we cannot answer with certainty because history, unlike maps and logistics charts, does not provide second drafts. But it is reasonable to suggest that Krueger would have prepared with the same exhaustive detail he had brought to every previous operation. He would have studied the terrain. He would have calculated the supply lines. He would have worked to minimize waste and unnecessary loss, though he would never have flinched from the cost that victory would demand. The invasion preparations moved forward through the spring and summer of 1945. Training intensified. Supplies were gathered and positioned. Shipping was allocated. The machinery of war, vast and complex and patient, ground steadily toward the autumn assault that seemed as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. And yet, somewhere within the Japanese government, and within the American government as well, the awareness was growing that the war had begun to reach its absolute conclusion. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, and when the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, the entire calculus shifted in a way that no amount of planning could have anticipated or accommodated. The Japanese surrender, when it came, was sudden and absolute. Operation Downfall never happened. Operation Olympic never launched its assault on the beaches of Kyushu. The Kanto Plain was never fought over. The final battle that strategists had been preparing for with such meticulous care simply did not occur. How many lives were spared by that sudden, unexpected conclusion? The answer depends on which casualty estimate one credits, which assumptions one accepts, which variables one weights most heavily in the calculation. If the lower estimates had held true, perhaps 50,000 American lives, perhaps hundreds of thousands more among Japanese soldiers and civilians who would have been swept into the grinding machinery of the final campaigns. If the higher estimates had been even partially correct, and we cannot know, then the sudden end of the war may have prevented one of the costliest military operations in human history. Krueger himself never publicly speculated about these matters with any great animation. He was not a man inclined to counterfactual narrative or public philosophizing about what might have been. He accepted the outcome as soldiers do, as the conclusion of events that had been set in motion long before and had run their course according to circumstances beyond any individual's control. The war was over. The invasion was unnecessary. Japan would surrender. The mathematics of victory, it turned out, could be rewritten by forces that even the most meticulous planner could not fully anticipate or command. What remained for Krueger now was not the glory of a final triumphant invasion, nor the satisfaction of seeing his careful plans executed against the heart of Japan itself. What remained was the work of transition, of winding down vast military organizations, of shepherding his army through the aftermath of war. And perhaps, in the quiet of his command tent, as the reality of peace slowly settled over the Pacific, there was a kind of relief, the understanding that the price the nation would pay had been far lower than anyone had dared hope, and that the terrible mathematics of invasion, with all their unknowable casualties and ungovernable consequences, had been rendered moot by history's sudden swerve. When the war ended in September 1945, Krueger was 60 years old. The Sixth Army had borne the brunt of some of the Pacific Theater's most grueling campaigns, and the general himself bore the invisible weight of those decisions. Thousands of lives committed to jungle terrain, to contested beaches, to the grinding mathematics of attrition and supply. The younger commanders, the ones with broader shoulders and louder voices, found themselves pulled toward Tokyo for the surrender ceremonies, toward the photographers and the newsreels. Krueger remained with his army in the Philippines, overseeing the occupation, ensuring the transition from combat to stability. It was unglamorous work, the kind that rarely made headlines, yet it demanded the same precision and human understanding that had guided his campaigns through impossible terrain. In the months that followed the Japanese capitulation, the general was tasked with managing the demobilization of his forces. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to be transported home, processed, returned to civilian life. The logistics alone would have seemed insurmountable to a lesser mind. Ships, supplies, documentation, the coordination of movements across the vast Pacific. Yet Krueger approached it with the same methodical calm he had brought to amphibious assaults. He understood that his men had given everything, and that the least he could offer in return was an orderly, dignified withdrawal from service. The supply lines he had perfected in wartime now served a different purpose, bringing his soldiers home. There was a certain poetry in that, though Krueger himself would never have framed it in such romantic terms. By 1946, the machinery of the post-war military was reshaping itself. The army had to shrink dramatically to recalibrate its thinking from global conflict to Cold War vigilance. Krueger was promoted to full general, a rank conferred less as recognition for past glories than as acknowledgement of his continued utility. For a time, he served as commander of Army ground forces in the continental United States, overseeing the vast infrastructure of stateside installations and training. It was, in many ways, a desk position after years of field command. The Pacific sun and humid jungle nights gave way to offices and staff meetings. Many of his peers chafed at such appointments, seeing them as slow descents into bureaucratic obscurity. Krueger, by nature and temperament, adapted without complaint. He had never sought the spotlight. The work itself, whatever its setting, was what mattered to him. As 1947 approached, the general contemplated retirement. He was now in his 60s, and while his mind remained sharp and his health relatively robust for a man of his years, the long service had begun to weigh. Decades of command, of living with the constant tension between ambition and responsibility, of carrying the knowledge that every order rippled outward into human consequence. These things accumulated in ways that were not always visible. The younger generation of officers was rising, shaped by different conflicts and different theories of warfare. Krueger saw in them the same hunger to prove themselves that he had felt in his youth, when he carried maps through army camps and studied foreign military treatises by candlelight. In 1948, Walter Krueger submitted his retirement request. The The army accepted it without fanfare. He left active duty after nearly 50 years of service, a span that encompassed the Spanish-American War, the interwar decades, the global catastrophe of World War II, and the uncertain dawn of the atomic age. Unlike some commanders who capitalized on their wartime fame through books, speaking engagements, or political ambitions, Krueger withdrew into private life with a quietness that seemed almost deliberate. He moved to Texas with his wife, Grace, settling in a modest home far from the centers of military power or public attention. He had always been a devoted husband, a man who carried photographs of his family and spoke of them with genuine affection. Now, finally, there was time to simply live with that devotion rather than steal moments around campaigns. The decades that followed were, by all accounts, peaceful. Krueger spent his mornings reading, his afternoons in quieter pursuits. He was a man of habit and discipline. These traits did not simply vanish with retirement, they only found new channels. He gardened, walked, and maintained the kind of regular routine that gave structure to days no longer dictated by battle plans or strategic conferences. He wrote occasionally, reflecting on his military experience, though he was never a prolific author. What he left behind in the way of written memoir was modest and factual, lacking the self-aggrandizement that characterized some generals' accounts. He seemed content to let his record speak for itself, an attitude both admirable and, to many eyes, almost frustratingly humble. The question of his legacy began to shift during these quiet years. As historians sifted through the Pacific War's vast archives, they increasingly recognized what Krueger's peers had long understood, that the Sixth Army's operations, though less celebrated than the island-hopping campaigns further north, had been logistically masterful and strategically essential. The Philippines campaign, once overshadowed by the drama surrounding MacArthur's return, began to be reassessed. Historians noted the careful coordination, the attention to supply chains, the casualty consciousness that had nonetheless driven forward relentlessly across terrible terrain. Slowly, quietly, Krueger's reputation began to recover something of its wartime standing, though never with the mythic quality of more celebrated commanders. He was acknowledged, but not lionized. Respected, but not revered in the popular imagination. Krueger seemed unmoved by these late career recognitions. He would receive academic inquiries, requests for interviews or appearances, and he would respond politely but briefly. He had said what he needed to say through his actions in the field. The work was done. What more was there to articulate? It was a perspective that many found mysterious or even off-putting. The world wanted narrative, drama, memorable sound bites, and Krueger offered only the spare language of a man describing what had simply needed to be done. As the 1950s progressed and then the 60s, the general aged gracefully into obscurity. The Korean War came and went. He was long retired by then, watching from afar as younger officers grappled with a different kind of limited conflict in a different part of Asia. The world moved faster now. The technologies of warfare accelerated, the geopolitical calculus transformed by nuclear weapons and the hardening Cold War divide. The lessons Krueger had learned through decades of military evolution seemed somehow of an older era, not because they were wrong, but because the context in which they applied had fundamentally shifted. He was widowed in his final years. Grace, his companion through all the moves and uncertainties of a military life, passed before him, leaving him in that strange twilight of very old age, when the present becomes increasingly sparse and the past grows vivid again. Did he reflect, in those hours of solitude, on the thousands of young men who had died under his command? Did he wonder what versions of themselves they might have become had different decisions been made? Such questions are not answerable, not for anyone who carried command responsibility. What can be said is that he carried himself with dignity in those final seasons, a quiet man living quietly, neither seeking redemption nor demanding recognition. Walter Krueger died in 1967, at the age of 83. His passing received modest obituary notices in the newspapers. A general had died, it was noted, one who had commanded armies in the Pacific. But there was no great outpouring of public grief, no massive funeral attended by dignitaries. He had lived the kind of life that did not demand such tributes. He had never courted them, never shaped his choices to secure them. And so, at the end, his death was as unassuming as his life had been relentlessly purposeful, the final quiet moment of a man who had always preferred substance to spectacle, who had moved through history not by proclaiming himself, but by simply doing what needed to be done, with precision, with care, and with a kind of grace that came from understanding that the real work of war was not won in dramatic moments, but in the accumulated decisions made in the solitary hours of command. And yet when the war ended, when the surrenders were signed, and the last of the soldiers began their slow journeys home, Walter Krueger simply faded. There were no triumphant ticker-tape parades for him, no best-selling memoirs written in a blaze of publicity, no post-war political ambitions or corporate board seats calling out his name. He retired quietly in 1946, having been passed over for the glamorous headlines that went to others, to the men who commanded fighter squadrons and led frontal assaults that made for better stories, faster photographs, the kind of warfare that newspapers could render in bold, simple strokes. Krueger's war had been different. It was measured in supply tonnages and tidal schedules, in the careful choreography of 10,000 moving parts, synchronized across vast ocean distances, in the lives preserved through meticulous planning rather than dramatic gestures. In the decades that followed, he lived out of the spotlight in a way that seems almost impossible for a man of his station in modern times. The general who orchestrated the liberation of the Philippines, who commanded armies through some of the Pacific's most consequential battles, spent his twilight years in relative obscurity. He wrote his memoirs, of course, a straightforward, unbending account called From Down Under to Nippon. But it was published without fanfare, read mostly by military historians and officers too disciplined to ignore the lessons it contained. The broader public, the civilians who had celebrated other war heroes, largely did not know his name. Even now, more than 70 years after the war's end, even as his campaigns are studied with meticulous care in war colleges around the world, there remains a quality of incompleteness to his recognition. Perhaps this absence itself tells us something profound about the nature of military leadership and about the kind of mind required to win wars of such terrible scope and complexity. Krueger's genius was not the sort that photographs well, that translates easily into legend or myth. It belonged instead to the realm of the invisible, to the officer who sees what others have missed, who thinks 3 moves ahead, who understands that an army marches on its stomach long before it marches on the battlefield. The Philippines were not conquered by a flash of intuition or a brilliant cavalry charge. They were seized methodically, island by island, beachhead by beachhead, through the patient accumulation of small advantages, through logistics that sang like music to anyone learned enough to hear it. What then remains of Walter Krueger, aside from the archived papers and the footnotes in academic histories? In some sense, he remains in the very structure of how modern militaries think about joint operations, the seamless coordination of Army, Navy, and Air Force that was still revolutionary in his time, but has now become doctrine. He remains in every operation that prioritizes the supply line as much as the sword, that measures success not only in territory gained, but in casualties avoided, in the careful calculation that preserves human life even in war's most brutal theater. His fingerprints are on the shape of modern amphibious warfare, on the planning methodologies that have been refined and passed down through generations of officers who may not even know they are following principles he helped establish. There is something almost poignant in this kind of legacy, not the blazing, immediate acclaim that flares bright and fades, but the slow, steady influence that persists because it is woven into the fabric of how things are done. Krueger never sought the spotlight. In fact, there is evidence that he actively resisted it, that his temperament inclined him toward the work itself rather than its recognition. He was a soldier of the old school in the best sense, one who understood that the job itself was the purpose, that the real victory was not in the heroic moment, but in the 1,000 small decisions made in tents and command posts that ensured those moments occurred at all. If you were to stand now on a beach in Luzon, or the Admiralty Islands, if you could somehow witness the landscape as it exists today, you would see little direct evidence of Walter Krueger's presence there. The jungles have reclaimed much, the barracks have crumbled. The supply depots are gone, and yet the Philippines exist as a free nation, in no small part because of the methodical brilliance of a German-born American general who understood that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones you simply make inevitable through patient, careful work. What might have changed if he had been a different sort of man? If he had sought glory instead of results? If he had pushed for more dramatic action, even when caution served better? If he had treated war as a stage for personal legend, rather than a terrible necessity to be managed with wisdom and restraint? We cannot know, but perhaps we might ask ourselves whether the world does not sometimes owe a greater debt to the quiet architects than to the thunderous performers, whether the generals we least remember are sometimes the ones whose judgment and discipline save the most lives. In his final years, Krueger lived far from the Pacific, in the American heartland, away from the waters where he had orchestrated so much. He died in 1967 at the age of 90, having seen the world he fought for transform again and again. The war was by then nearly a generation past, its urgencies already fading into history. And yet somewhere in military academies and strategic studies programs, his name persists in the reading lists. His battles remain case studies. His thinking continues to shape the minds of officers who will never know that they are learning from Walter Krueger. The night air carries the sound of distant waves, the same rhythm that moved across the Pacific when ships full of soldiers turned toward islands they did not yet know. The jungle sounds have faded now, replaced by the pulse of memory and the slow, certain knowledge